Filosofía de la Universidad de Costa Rica. Gracias a todas y todos por su presencia y en particular, buenas tardes y muchas gracias a nuestro primer speaker de hoy, el profesor Timothy Williamson. Ahora enunciaré un par de reglas simples pero muy importantes, para la utilización de Zoom en nuestro Congreso, como haremos cada día. Después pasaré la traducción de la presente notas en inglés y al final introduciré nuestro speaker simplemente en inglés, ya que la exposición de hoy, el talk, será completamente en inglés. Primera y muy importante regla, por favor, mantengan el micrófono apagado durante todo el desarrollo de la exposición, ya que podría ser difícil para mí identificar inmediatamente la persona con el micrófono abierto y tendría que mutear a todos, ¿verdad? Con consecuentes, problemas. Segunda cosa, tenemos un espacio apósito, ¿no?, para preguntas y respuestas al final de la exposición, donde por favor, quien quiera hacer preguntas, me escriba privatamente en el chat la Q de question, y yo le daré la palabra en orden cronológico. Esta es la manera para respetar el orden, ¿verdad? Daré la palabra apenas llegará a su turno. So good morning and good evening, respectively, to everybody, and welcome to the second day of our third colloquium of epistemology, first Congress, International Congress of Logic, Epistemology, and Methodology, the School of Philosophy in the University of Costa Rica. Thank you all for being with us, and particularly good evening, and thank you very much to Professor Timothy Williamson, our first guest today. Now we'll enunciate two very important and very simple rules about the use of Zoom for our Congress. First thing, please leave the microphone switched off during the whole talk, because it could be quite difficult for me to identify immediately who has the microphone open, and maybe I should mute everybody and then give our guest, our speaker, another time the word. Will be quite uneasy in this sense. Second rule, after the talk, we have provided an appropriate time for question and answer. To make a question, please write me privately in the chat, not in the public chat, in the private chat. Just the word question or the letter Q. And this way, I will respect the order of some of the people who want to ask something to the professor. That's what about the rules and the welcome speech. Now I will introduce our first guest, Professor Timothy Williamson, originally from Sweden. He's a world-renowned epistemologist, philosopher of language, and ontologist, philosophical logician, and philosopher of philosophy. He has held the Wykeham Chair in Logic at the University of Oxford since 2000. After obtaining a BA in Mathematics and Philosophy and a PhD in Philosophy, both from Oxford, he was Professor of Philosophy at Trinity College Dublin, Fellow and Tutor at University College Oxford, and Professor of Logic and Metaphysics at the University of Edinburgh. Professor Williamson was the president of the Aristotelian Society as well as the Mind Association, and he's a fellow of the British Academy as well as the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He holds foreign honorary member status with organizations including the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Timothy Williamson is the author of Vagueness, 94, Knowledge and Its Limit, 2000, The Philosophy of Philosophy, 2007, Modal Logic as Metaphysics, 2013, Doing Philosophy, From Common Curiosity to Logical Reasoning, then under the title Method, A Very Short Introduction, 2020, Suppose Entail, The Semantics and Heuristics of Conditional, 2020, and of course with Paul Boghossian, Debating the A Priori, 2020. Furthermore, he has published more than 200 articles. Professor Williamson's epistemicist position with the central assumption of a non-exceptionalism of philosophy in relation to the other sciences undoubtedly represent one of the most important and influential developments in current philosophy. So far, his work has been translated into 20 languages. In the talk of today, Professor Williamson will face the epistemological ambivalence. That's the title of the talk. During the lecture, Professor Williamson will argue that there can be epistemic dilemmas, situations where different epistemic norms conflict. So whatever the agent does will violate at least one of those norms. The point is that in some situations, local and global norms conflict. What satisfies a local norm violates a global norm, and what satisfies a global norm violates a local norm. Failure to distinguish between local and global aspects of normativity has led to confusion about the nature of rationality itself. Thank you very much, Professor Williamson, to your word.
Right, thank you. Let me just share my screen. Okay, good. Thank you. Well, and thanks very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be virtually in Costa Rica, and I'm sure it'd be a much greater pleasure to be actually in Costa Rica. So I'll just say a little bit about how I'm understanding the title of this this talk. Ambivalence is, roughly speaking, being pulled in opposite directions by different values. And probably the best known version of this is in moral dilemmas, when, for example, we have conflicting duties, so that whatever we do will violate one of our duties. And this goes back to the famous example given by Jean-Paul Sartre of the young man who feels he has a duty to join the resistance against the German occupiers, but also feels he has a duty to look after his aging mother, and those duties are not compatible. If he carries out one, he will fail in the other. But I'm going to be interested in cases which are not moral, although they still are in some way normative, in epistemology as well. And I'm going to be arguing that these kind of epistemic dilemmas of a sort can arise, and also that when we fail to recognize their presence, and the way in which they're, as it were, coloring our judgments, it can cause confused theorizing. To begin with, I'm just going to put, as it were, an example on the table to consider. So the example I want you to imagine is that of a competent mathematician who has just proved a surprising new theorem. And she shows her proof to several distinguished senior colleagues who all tell her that the proof involves a subtle fallacy, that it does not work. And when they explain what the fallacy is supposed to be, she can't quite follow their explanations of her mistake. And in fact, the only mistake is in their objections, which is concealed by the kind of sophisticated bluster that they use in giving their pseudo explanations of what's wrong with her proof. But the proof is actually perfectly valid by the standards of mathematical proof. And I leave it to you to decide what the motivations of these mathematicians are, whether they are themselves confused or whether they're hoaxing her, or they for some other reason, they don't want her career to advance, whatever it is. You can fill in that bit of the story for yourself. And so one question is she in a position to know that her result is correct? What is she justified in believing? I'm not going to assume that as it were, I've given you completely sufficient information to determine the answer to these questions, because it might to some extent depend on how complicated the proof is and just how expert the senior colleagues are, and all sorts of things like that. So as it were, there are many different flavors of this example, which may be significantly different. But I do want, on the one hand, that the proof is valid, and on the other hand, that these senior colleagues have considerable credibility in virtue of their track records and their relevant expertise and so on. And it's certainly not, as it were, just trivially obvious that they're talking nonsense or something like that. So when the mathematician is thinking about what to think about this case, she is likely to feel ambivalent. Again, of course, how she feels will also depend on what kind of person she is. But there are two opposite pressures that are pulling her in different directions, and so the mathematician feels ambivalent, but also we as epistemologists may feel ambivalent about this case. I don't know that everybody feels ambivalent, but I as it were, I want you to construct the case in such a way that there is a strong pull on each side. And as it were, as epistemologists, we feel ambivalent on behalf of the mathematician. Of course, our situation is in some ways different from hers, in part because it's simply, as I've stipulated the example, it's just a condition of the example that the proof is in fact valid. And so we don't need to feel any doubt on that score. But of course, we can still appreciate that the mathematician herself isn't in a position to rely on this stipulation about the example. I mean, that's, as it were, just a condition of the fiction, if you like. And so as we can appreciate on her behalf that it's not a trivial issue. And as it were, to put the conflict as in a fairly strong way, I mean, if she believes that her proof is valid, she's disrespecting the evidence of her colleagues' testimony. And as I say, I want you to imagine the example in such a way that her colleague's testimony carries considerable weight. But on the other hand, if she believes that her proof is invalid, then she disrespects the evidence of the proof itself, as well the intrinsic structure of the proof, which is in fact valid. So, you might think that, as it were, she could slip between the horns of that dilemma by being agnostic, by not forming a belief either way. But as I'm setting up the example, I want it to be a case where if she has no belief, she somewhat disrespects both kinds of evidence. She somewhat disrespects the evidence of her colleague's testimony, but she also somewhat disrespects the evidence of the proof itself, as it were, because the colleague's testimony demands that she believe that the proof is invalid, and the proof itself, as it were, demands that she believe that it's valid, putting it crudely. And so agnosticism, having no belief about the matter, is not an easy or safe option in a case like this. So that's, I'm not, as it was, so much concerned with resolving the dilemma any more than, as it was, Sartre was concerned with deciding whether this young man should join the resistance or look after his aging mother. But I think the dilemma is interesting in its own right. One way in which it resembles moral dilemmas is that it's a dilemma for an agent who's responsible, self-conscious, language using, and she's actually reflecting on the issues, and she's deliberately managing her own cognitive projects. And so, as it were, it presents itself in a very conscious way as a question, what should I believe? What should I do about this conflict? And of course, a great deal of epistemology is about just such reflective agents. And so we could think through the example in that light. And of course, that's a case which brings our perspective as epistemologists and the perspective of the mathematician herself, as it were, who's thinking about the epistemology of her current situation. That brings those two perspectives close together, although it doesn't quite make them identical. But I think it's also important to remember that knowledge and belief are not confined to reflective agents of this kind. Young children and many non-human animals have knowledge of their environment, and as well as knowledge, they have true and false beliefs about their environment. And in fact, for many animals, it's a matter of life and death to have such knowledge. I mean, if you're a predator, a leopard, for example, then you need to know where your prey is, where the impalas are. And if you're the prey, the impalas, you need to know where the leopard is. And if you're ignorant of those things, the result can easily be death. So I'm not thinking of knowledge and belief as some highly intellectual states, although of course in particular cases they may be very intellectual states, as in the case of our mathematician, but they're much more widespread than that. And in my view, epistemology does better to start with such non-reflective creatures because they're cognitively much simpler. And so it's, in some ways, it's less confusing to theorize about them because there are fewer different levels to consider. And we're less tempted by the dangers of over-intellectualization and of, as it were, treating every knowing subject as if they were some kind of proto-philosopher and judging them by the kind of dialectical standards that we might apply to a piece of philosophy rather than a piece of just very ordinary knowledge or belief about one's environment. It also seems actually quite plausible, in fact, almost inevitable, that in some way, human knowledge and belief is built on top of, as were the more primitive kinds that I should have said human and adult knowledge and belief, built on the more primitive kinds that we find amongst non-human animals and young children. So that, as it were, in our knowledge and belief, we never, as it were, completely transcend our status as simply intelligent animals. And I mean, perhaps the most obvious examples of that involve perceptual knowledge, where our perceptual apparatus is in many ways extremely similar to that of other species, although of course the specific perceptual judgments that we make will be different. I guess the disadvantage of starting with cases like young children and non-human animals is that, as it were, we have less knowledge of those cases from the inside, but that also may be not simply a disadvantage, but in some ways an advantage as well, because we won't be overwhelmed by introspective impressions of what cognition involves. So following the methodology of, as it were, starting with relatively simple cases of cognition, the question I want to pursue for a while is whether epistemological ambivalence can arise for these non-reflective creatures. So in cases very different from that of our mathematician. And so we're talking about creatures who can be uncertain. I mean, you can sometimes observe uncertainty in cats and dogs and so on, but presumably they can't reflect on their uncertainty. But as epistemologists, we can reflect on their uncertainty. Now, of course, when we start thinking about ambivalence as something like an epistemic analog of moral dilemmas, then we're going to think of it in highly normative terms. We're going to ask, what is the agent justified in believing? What ought the agent to believe? And these might seem like the kind of questions that really only arise for responsible agents. And so, as well, we might be tempted to think that these kind of epistemic dilemmas could only arise at the more sophisticated level, where we are dealing with responsible, reflective agents. And so there's an initial puzzle, if we start from the case of moral dilemmas, about how ambivalence can arise in these simpler cases. But I think we should do better not to take a moral normativity as were the paradigm that we use for thinking about these examples, but a kind of normativity which is relevant to very simple creatures, and that is some sort of functional normativity. So we can say that something is wrong with a heart which can't pump blood. Something is wrong with a spider's web which can't catch flies. So, because the function of the heart, in some sense, is to pump blood, and so it's something is wrong with a heart which can't fulfill its function, and likewise with a spider's web. And what I want to suggest is that something is wrong with a belief which can't provide information on which to act. Because in some sense, it seems like the function of a belief is to provide such information, that, as it were, that's the point of having a mind, is to go in for intelligent action, which takes it into account the changing and complex environment that you're in. One thing I should say about the notion of functionality that I'm using, I'm not going to give this very much analysis. Of course, with examples like hearts and spiders' webs, it's quite plausible to think of the relevant kind of functionality as having to do with evolutionary history, but I don't want to assume anything quite as specific as that, because I don't want to rule out the possibility that, as for example, someone could build a sufficiently intelligent robot that it counts as having knowledge and belief, and there the functionality would be of a somewhat different kind. So I'm, for present purposes, I'm going to leave this notion of functionality in a fairly programmatic state. Now, I mean, I said something's wrong with a belief which can't provide information on which to act, but obviously information here doesn't just mean random propositions, since having a random proposition generator would not serve the function of belief. If it just came up with, as it would, if it just had a whole pile of propositions and it picked one at random and gave it to you to act on, that would not be what you needed. That certainly wouldn't be of much evolutionary value if that's what you had. In fact, I mean, if you think about it in evolutionary terms, but also if you think about it in terms of doing something like designing a robot, when we're talking about information on which to act, it needs to be something much more like knowledge than like belief. That the point of having a mind is not simply to act on whatever old beliefs you happen to have. It's to act on your knowledge of the environment. And so the hypothesis that I'm sympathetic to is that a belief which does not amount to knowledge is defective, and a belief which does amount to knowledge is non-defective in this kind of functional sense. So as it were, that's what a belief should be in some way, and applying that norm even to very simple creatures does not seem to involve some over intellectualization of them. I mean, if the leopard or the impalas, if they're acting on beliefs which are false or true but only luckily so, there's something wrong with those beliefs. Which doesn't, as it were, require one to think of these animals as proto-philosophers or anything like that. Now, I'll just briefly consider a couple of objections which might occur to what I've been saying about the norm for belief. And so one objection is that false beliefs can be beneficial, but they're still not knowledge. And so the idea is, well, if they're beneficial, then they're not defective. And one example which is sometimes given is that overestimating yourself may give you the self-confidence to succeed in a task. But I'm assuming that although you succeed, it's still a genuine overestimate of your own capacity. And of course, it's true that false beliefs sometimes do confer benefits. I mean, I think it would be hard to deny that. But I think that objection doesn't really engage with the notion of a function at the right sort of level. So being beneficial is not a function in the relevant sense. Otherwise, presumably all organs would have the same function. I mean, as where they would all just have the function of benefiting the agent. And if we can't distinguish between different organs in terms of their function, then functional thinking is not going to be of very much use. So something like being beneficial is just too general to be the function of belief. But something like boosting self-confidence is too specific to be the function of belief, because it's irrelevant to most beliefs. And I mean, what we're looking for is a function at the level of, as it were, belief in general, and being knowledge seems to have just about the right level of generality to be the function of belief. It's not too general and it's not too specific. So another kind of objection which you might make to the knowledge norm for belief is that that knowledge which you never act on is not beneficial at all. I mean, the supposed function of belief was to provide knowledge to act on, but then what if you never do act on that knowledge? I think that objection just doesn't engage with the notion of function in an appropriate way. So what seems plausible is that the function of belief is to provide knowledge for you to act on if you need it. And so, I mean, we might compare it with a type of antibody in your blood, which will protect you against a specific type of lethal pathogen. So that type of pathogen may be so rare that you never encounter it. But that doesn't mean that those antibodies were defective. I mean, they were there for you if you needed them. I think this is related to the way that that so many animals and, of course, children are curious in a fairly sort of open-ended way. They just like gathering knowledge about their environment, finding out what's going on, sort of nosing around anything that's a bit unusual, and so on. And it's not because they always have some, as it were, specific use to make of this knowledge. It's just good to be knowledgeable about your environment in a fairly general way, because you never know what knowledge is going to come in handy. And so the idea that some of the stuff that we know never, in fact, answers any particular need that we have for it is not a good objection to the knowledge norm for belief. So that's a norm for, as it were, particular beliefs. And of course, one observation to make is that a norm for individual beliefs is vacuously satisfied if there's no belief, because then there's nothing to be defective. And I think that's the attraction of agnosticism, and indeed of the kinds of skepticism that lead to agnosticism, if you can really manage to live your skepticism. I mean, the idea is that forming a belief there's always this risk, and so you can avoid having these defective beliefs just by being agnostic about everything, by refusing to form beliefs, by suspending judgment. So, of course, one effect of this is that just having a norm for specific beliefs doesn't, in the sense of a standard for non-defectiveness in beliefs, it can't generate dilemmas of the kind illustrated at the beginning, because agnosticism always provides an escape. But of course, if we think again in functional terms, if the function of belief is to provide knowledge to act on, then there's something wrong with agnosticism, since it provides nothing to act on. But the defect is not with any particular belief, since by hypothesis, if just oversimplifying it, if we assume that there are no beliefs, then there's nothing to be defective. I mean, of course, it's not really humanly possible under normal conditions. If you're not in a coma or something, it's not humanly possible not to have some beliefs, probably. But so it seems that the problem with, as it were, agnosticism and not forming beliefs is it's not a defect in any particular belief. It's a defect in the belief-forming system as a whole. And so what we have is a contrast between global norms, which are applicable to the whole belief-forming system, as well as local norms, which are applicable to individual beliefs. And so, in particular, at the level of a global norm, a non-defective belief system is organized to provide plenty of knowledge. Whereas an over-skeptical belief system provides too little knowledge. and as I say, that's the problem with skepticism. It's not, you avoid having defective beliefs, but you do it at the cost of having a defective belief system, a non-functional belief system. Of course, you can also have an over-credulous belief system, which provides too much belief, which is not knowledge, and maybe false. So one way of understanding what's going on in the original case of the mathematician, of understanding the ambivalence, is as a resulting from a conflict between local and global norms. So at the local level, the valid proof is decisive. In that sense, she can know that her result is correct. Again, there's more than one way of constructing the example. So, but at least for a large class of cases, this will hold. So, as it were, she's got absolutely decisive evidence for the theorem. But at the global level, a more reliable methodology allows the opinions of several experts to outweigh individual judgment. And there will certainly be cases where as well, a sensible, if you like, strategy cognitively will be to let the opinion of experts, as well, when they're sufficiently when they've got a sufficiently good track record, etc., to let that outweigh your individual judgment, and so one way of thinking of the case is that if the mathematician ignores the accredited experts and believes her results to be correct, her belief may indeed be knowledge, and so in that sense non-defective, but it may also indicate something globally wrong with her belief system. This is similar to some cases that Maria Lasonen-Arnio has been discussing in relation to her critique of the very popular epistemological idea of defeat, which she's arguing, I think, with considerable plausibility that it's actually based on a misunderstanding of what's going on in these cases. So, as it were, you can have cases of lucky knowledge where, as it were, you back a particular form case. I mean, of evidence, with this proof, and you may get knowledge from that, but it may also be a manifestation of a disposition which in the long run is likely to lead you into a lot of trouble. A disposition, as it were, which is overall dysfunctional for the cognitive system, but may nevertheless produce occasional rewards. There are also cases of the converse, where a globally non-defective belief system produces locally defective beliefs, and these are in a way more familiar. So the typical examples are skeptical scenarios. So, for example, an illusion that something is an orange in the bowl. And in fact, it's not an orange, it's just a wax replica of an orange. And I mean, let's assume that it's an excellent replica. So, and you're not actually trying to eat it, you're just looking at it. So if you resisted forming the belief that it's a genuine orange, your belief system would be defective by being over-skeptical, because the price of that level of skepticism is that you'll resist forming a belief in the 99% of cases where it actually is a genuine orange there, and in all sorts of similar cases. So the non-defective belief system will lead you to form beliefs in such a case. But nevertheless, the individual belief that it's an orange is defective because it's false, and so not knowledge. It's not, as it were, serving the function of belief. So that we've got these conflicts between local and global norms both way rounds. We can have local defectiveness with global non-defectiveness, and global defectiveness with local non-defectiveness. So if we fail to distinguish global from local norms and operate with a single normative standard, which we might call, for example, justification, our account will be confused, and we'll fail to understand the nature of our ambivalence in such cases. Because we'll be missing the structure of them. We'll be missing the way in which there are the local and the global norms are pulling in different directions. And so I want to say a bit about how this sort of distinction applies to the case of rationality. So one way in which we speak of rational beliefs is as beliefs that are adequately supported by evidence. And I'm taking that as a local norm. Of course, adequately supported by evidence. I'm not, for the moment, I'm not going to talk about whether that amounts to knowledge or whether it's some lower standard. But even if it's a lower standard, it's still a local norm, because it has to do with the, as it were, specific relation between the content of one particular belief and the content of your evidence at the relevant time. And so, as it were, where there's some kind of appropriate match, we might speak of rational beliefs. We also speak of rational agents. So notice now that the term rational is being transferred from the beliefs to the agents who have the beliefs. But if we're going to talk about rational agents, then presumably the way they're related, what we might think to the rationality of beliefs, is that that rational agents are those whose beliefs and actions tend to be adequately supported by evidence. As where they have some kind of disposition that way, although the disposition might be frustrated in difficult, abnormal conditions. And so the rationality of the agents is something at the level of a global norm. It has to do with their whole belief system, the system for forming beliefs, not simply with a particular belief at a particular time. Now, the really confusing thing is that once we've got a notion of a rational agent, we can use that notion to go back to the local level again, and to speak of rational beliefs and indeed rational actions as beliefs and actions which a rational agent would or might have or do in the circumstances. So that's a local application of the global norm. And so we're back to speaking of rational beliefs, but via this kind of digression through the rationality of the agents. And I think it's very observable in a lot of epistemology, maybe decision theory too, that we fail to distinguish these two senses of rational beliefs and rational actions, and so treat them as equivalent. And so for example, you sometimes see in the same writer, even the same paper, that sometimes they're talking about rational beliefs as the one appropriately supported by evidence, but sometimes when they're talking about rational beliefs, they're saying that something is a rational belief because, after all, that's exactly what a rational person would believe in those circumstances, which is an appeal to the second notion of rational belief, the one that's defined in terms of a rational agent. Now, you might think that because the notion of a rational agent was in turn defined as one who, as it were, with a disposition to have rational beliefs and perform rational actions, that these two notions of rational belief and of rational actions, that they couldn't come apart. But that's a mistake. They can. They're not equivalent. And one way they can fail to be equivalent is if there can be illusions of evidence, for example, in skeptical scenarios, then a rational agent might have a belief or do an action which seems to be supported by evidence, but in fact is not. So let's just, for a moment, let's just suppose that there can be illusions of evidence. I'll say something about why that's likely to be the case in a minute. But if we're in a situation like that, then we can have a belief which is in fact not supported by the evidence, but which, and therefore which is not rational in the first sense, but it's nevertheless, it seems to be supported by the evidence because there's an illusion of evidence. And so it's a kind of belief that a rational agent would have in those circumstances, because a rational agent in those circumstances would be taken in by the illusion of evidence, and so would form a belief that was in fact not adequately based on the evidence. And So, I mean, if for example, it might be that in the little skeptical scenario that I mentioned before, that the agent has the illusion of having as evidence that the fact that there's an orange in the bowl, which they might then use as evidence for other propositions, such as that somebody had recently bought some oranges or something like that. But given that evidence has to be true, it would in fact not be a piece of their evidence. Now, I think one of the ways in which this confusion about rationality has, as it were, distorted epistemological thinking is by making people suppose that there can't really be illusions of evidence, and as we're, if they're assuming that implicitly that these two senses of rational belief are equivalent, simply by not distinguishing them, then given that they come apart if there are illusions of evidence, it's putting pressure on people to think that there just can't be illusions of evidence. And so that pressures people into trying to conceive of evidence in such a way that there could not be illusions of evidence. And that's why there's so much attraction to the idea, for example, that your evidence just consists in how things seem to you, or something like that, because we can at least, as we piously hope, that how things seem to you is not itself subject to illusions. Whereas if we thought of evidence in the normal kind of way, such as you find in, for example, in natural science, where evidence consists of facts about the world. I mean, for example, facts about how many rats in the experiment died, or whether there's an orange in a bowl or whatever, it's quite clear that there can be illusions of evidence. But of course, there are lots of reasons for thinking that there can be illusions of evidence, even if you treat evidence as simply consisting in the appearances, the present appearances to the subject. I mean, I would, by the way, say, if you really think of evidence as present appearances to the subject, that so radically impoverishes our stock of evidence that there's very little that we're entitled to believe on the basis of evidence of that kind. But in any case, we can be under illusions, even about how things, for example, perceptually appear, so that we might, we might be under an illusion that, it perceptually, for example, that let's say that the right and the left halves of some visual scenario that we were perceiving, that they were mirror images of each other or something like that. We might have the illusion that the left, as it were, the appearance of the left half and the appearance of the right half were symmetrical, when in fact it was just because somebody had told us that they were going to be symmetrical that we would mistake that, and it might be very hard to actually to know what your evidence is once you start thinking about appearances in a fine-grained, careful way. So my view is that really whatever evidence is, there can in principle be illusions of evidence, and so those will pull apart these two different senses of rational belief and rational action, and so they, as it were, no kind of strange theory of evidence will fix this problem. It's rather that we're simply dealing with two different notions of a rational belief and a rational action, which are related in the kind of way that I've explained. And the key is just not to confuse them. And once we do that, we're not pressuring ourselves into having some kind of fanciful conception of evidence that doesn't really work. I'm just adding here that in Knowledge and Its Limits, I gave a specific argument that there can always be illusions of evidence. That has to do with the anti-luminosity considerations. I'm not going to go through those in detail today. So the conclusion that I'm coming to is that that we need to have a distinction between local and global norms. Local norms, such as a knowledge norm for belief, and a global norm for a whole cognitive system, which will, as it were, include cognitive policies, which sometimes result in false beliefs. I think what one form of epistemological ambivalence comes from tensions between the local and global norms. And if we're not aware of this possibility of tension, then we're risking confusion in epistemology, for example, in the sort of way that I illustrated, where by failing to distinguish between two conceptions of rational belief and rational action, we put pressure on ourselves to think of evidence in a sort of hopeless way, such that there just cannot be any illusions of evidence, whereas in fact evidence, like pretty much anything else, it is subject occasionally to illusions. And so the kind of ambivalence that I've been talking about is something that we need to be on the lookout for in epistemology, so that we can recognize it for what it is and not allow it to trick us into going down dead ends in epistemology. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Williamson, for your very interesting talk. We will immediately open the space for question and answer. Please write to me privately, just Q or question, so I will respect the order of the question. I have already the first one. This is from Professor Mario Solis, University of Costa Rica.
Hello, hi. Thank you, Professor Williamson. This is a wonderful talk, and I enjoyed it and learned a lot from it. I have a couple of questions, and let me see if I can just be clear about the question and try to construct, to give the background of the question. And I don't know if you hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
The first question is about, say, true beliefs, knowledge, vis-a-vis facts and reasons, epistemic reasons. And it has to do with if there's a gap. I find that there's a gap between that, always a gap between facts, reasons, and beliefs. And I don't know if for instance, with the case of the mathematician, perhaps is that a fact or is that a reason? The proof is valid. Is that a fact in total, or is it just the proving and the cake, but not the recipe? It's just the proving and the cake, but not the recipe. So I have a question about that. If there is a gap between fact and reason. The second question has to do with the fundamental distinction you made. That is a local level, global level. And the question is double again. First simple question is, would you use here, there's another distinction here that I'm interested in, and I don't know if you would use it. That is to say, the distinction between first and second order reasons and reasoning. And if you would use or not that category of first and second order reasoning. And if so, that's the second part of the question. The connection between global and local is, if there is any, of course, if there's any connection, it's about reasoning, not about beliefs or agents. Isn't it that right? If the answer would be positive about the second question, that is to say. So it's a question about the connection between the two levels on the one hand, and if you use first and second order reasoning or reasons for that. And the first question is about gaps between facts and then reason and action and believing. Yes. That game of, that strain, that game.
Yes. So, first of all, in answer to the first question about facts and reasons, I think the literature on reasons makes a distinction between the being a reason and someone's having a reason, and so, for example, if someone, let's say, is hiding a gun in his pocket, I mean, there is a reason to be careful of that man, but that's not a reason for which you can act unless you possess the reason, and possessing the reason seems to be a matter of actually knowing the fact that you know that he has a gun in his pocket, and so I would say that that reason itself is simply the fact, whatever fact it happens to be, but possessing the reason is a matter of knowing the fact. And I think it really has to be knowledge, not just true belief, because as a way, you don't give yourself genuine reasons just by sort of completely irrationally forming beliefs, even if they happen to be true. So that's what I would say about the first question. The second question was about the relation between the local global distinction and the first order, second order reasoning distinction. So they're not exactly the same, because presumably for simple animals and so on, they're not really capable of second order reasoning, I suppose, if they're simple enough. Probably cats and dogs can't do second order reasoning about reasoning about their own reasons, and so they don't do second order reasoning. But there is still a distinction between the local and global norms of non-defectiveness, even for the beliefs of a cat or a dog, because on the one hand, as we can apply the knowledge norm to the beliefs of a cat or a dog, and where their beliefs fail to constitute knowledge, there's something defective about their beliefs. But we can also apply a global norm, so that, as it were, a highly skeptical, let's make it a wild animal, let's say a highly skeptical leopard or something would be in great trouble in the wild, because it just wouldn't be forming enough beliefs about their environment. If they're suspending judgment the whole time, I mean, they're just not going to get to eat. And so, I think what's true is that in formulating the global norm, we may be doing some, or in reasoning about it, we may be doing some second order reasoning, because we're thinking about what are good patterns of reasoning, for a creature to have. And so at that level, we as epistemologists are doing some second order reasoning. I mean, or maybe it's even, might even end up being third order reasoning, in fact. But because the local global distinction is really a distinction that applies to anything that is capable of having beliefs at all, it doesn't, it can be applied to creatures who don't do second order reasoning. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we'll go on with the second question. I have 5 more. Next one is from Professor Gillian Russell.
Hi, Tim.
Hi.
My question is about kind of how bad epistemological ambivalence is supposed to be, and kind of in what way it's bad. So there's a way of thinking about what you just said, where it's almost like the epistemological ambivalence is a kind of paradox. Like, I find myself, I ought to believe P, and I ought to not believe P. And now, like, the question is, well, what's going on? This is really confusing. And then here's the solution. There's one sense of ought, which is like conform to a certain set of norms, the global ones, and a different sense of ought that's conformed to the local norms. And now we've solved the problem. It kind of, if that was going on, you might expect, say, all epistemological ambivalence to be resolved in that kind of way. So maybe there's no epistemological ambivalence that results from like conflict among the local norms, and no epistemological ambivalence that results from like conflict among the global norms. But on the other hand, I don't know, you might think epistemological ambivalence is not that bad, and maybe it's just the tragedy of the human condition. We end up with this sometimes. So I kind of wondered, like, what the role is that it's playing.
Yeah. So, in some ways, the badness that I was emphasizing was not so much the badness of the ambivalence itself as the badness of not recognizing the ambivalence for what it is, and assuming that, as it were, there would be, a much blander kind of resolution of the problems than there actually is. The one specific thing you asked about was whether there can be local norms. I mean, sort of conflicts and ambivalence. And in fact, I think there can be, because, and in fact, I think you can get it with, cases of illusions of evidence, because there's a conflict between going with your evidence and going with what your evidence seems to be, and when there are illusions of evidence, that they will sometimes pull in different directions. And I think that those I mean, ignoring those kind of conflicts as well, also leads to similar problems about looking for some transparent category of evidence that just isn't there, because I mean, I think the problem is there that whatever local norm we lay down, or as we assume to be correct, that there will be cases of illusions as to whether the local norm is in fact satisfied or not. And because of such illusions, there'll be some temptation to say that the agent shouldn't go with the norm that we first thought of, but with some norm that, as it were, has to do with the appearance of satisfaction of the first norm rather than whether it's, and of course then, but we're kind of in a hopeless position, because any norm that we can think of can be trumped by as it were the appearances, or can seem to be trumped by them, and so we. Again, this is something, in fact, that I've worked out in gory detail in the kind of the paper that this talk is based on. But the gory detail wasn't really fun enough to be worth going into detail. But definitely you can have the local conflicts, and. So, I mean, as I say, my feeling is in some ways it's really at the level of theory that the ambivalence has the worst effects. I mean, of course it does. I mean, illusions of evidence can have all sorts of effects and so on. But in some way, the fact that we're being pulled different ways is something that we somehow we manage to kind of muddle through reasonably well most of the time. I mean, well, of course, it's not as though human cognition meets such great standards most of the time, but I mean, we as it were, we tend not to be tortured by it in the way that such as a young man is supposed to be tortured. But
I'm not so sure about that. I mean, somebody who's taking a logic class and thinks they understand something, but then somebody says something and thinks their proof is wrong, they could be pretty tortured by not being sure about whether they get it yet or not.
Yes, actually, I agree with that. So I don't want. I mean, I don't want to press this too far, but as it were, I've. For purposes of this talk, I've been abandoning the poor logic student and worrying more about what the effect is on theoretical epistemology, which might make it, as it were, a somewhat niche take on these issues.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. The next one, Professor Sanford Goldberg.
Tim, good to see you. Thanks for the talk. I really enjoyed it. One question on which you were studiously silent and which is clearly raised by your talk is the question, what ought a person to believe in the cases you describe? And I can imagine various answers. And when I was trying to figure out what your answer would be, it dawned on me that you've given some indication that you like one of them and also some indication that you like another, in which case I feel ambivalent about what your answer should be. So here's one answer to the question, what ought to be believed in these cases? That's a bad question. Here's another answer. It's a good question, but there's no answer to it, or it's a good question, but there are many equally good or equally bad answers. Now, for a lot of your talk, I thought that would be the view. One of those three views would be the view that you'd go in for. However, I was tripped up by your appeal to the evolutionary functional account of normativity for belief. Because if that's your answer, here's another answer to what ought the person to believe in this case. Well, the person in this case always ought to go with the global norm, because after all, presumably, if evolution has an effect on us, it's instilling the kinds of character traits or cognitive character traits that do well over the long run, not in particular cases. So then I thought maybe your answer would be, what should the person believe in these cases? The person should always go in for conforming to the global norm, which I have strong views is not, in fact, your view. But now I'm confused as to what you think we should say in response to the question, what ought to be believed in these kinds of cases?
Yeah, so I guess going along with the global norm, that seems a little bit like rule consequentialism or something. And so, I take it that the kinds of cognitive dispositions that we're talking about, I mean, they're not overriding dispositions which as it were can never be violated, and so although of course it's good to have those dispositions, in a particular situation, it would also be good to violate them on that occasion, because that way, for example, you if it's the local norm, that way you get knowledge, and so what I'm most moved by are just the local and global norms, and it's not clear to me what kind of all things considered norm, as people sometimes put it, that should be, and it might be that as it were, if we go to an all things considered norm, then that's really taking us outside the realm of epistemology, and it might even be that if it's really all things considered, then all sorts of other pragmatic and maybe even moral factors come into play, which epistemology itself has got nothing to say about. So as it were, it seems to me that really what we get from these kinds of epistemological considerations are just a sort of battery of norms on sort of different things, and and with some of them are, as it were, primary, some are secondary, and so on. So that some are derivative from others, and I don't really see that epistemology provides a good any particular principle for combining them into one norm to rule them all, sort of thing. And of course, in practice, we have to go one way or the other, and all sorts of things can be in play there. But I'm reluctant to offer any particular resolution. I sort of feel, well, as well, this is just what we have to suffer, and that's the situation we're in, and we shouldn't expect some kind of formula to resolve the norms.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Professor Paul Bogossin.
Hello, Tim.
Oh.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, yes.
Great. I wanted to get a little clearer on this very interesting developing picture that you're creating. It just goes back to the orange, the wax orange in the bowl. So on the story, I take it that my belief that there is an orange in the bowl is not merely false, but irrational, because it isn't adequately proportioned to the evidence. There is no evidence that there is a real orange in the bowl. But the implausibility, as one might feel, of this verdict is to be somewhat mitigated by the fact that it's consistent with that the agent is on the whole rational, globally rational, by having a set of dispositions to adequately proportion beliefs to real evidence as opposed to illusory evidence, on the whole. And I have one question about that I want, whether we can get the inverted brain to be a rational agent. But I want to ask something slightly more fundamental because I'm not clear about it. And that is a potential circularity in the notion of a rational agent. So the rational agent has a disposition to proportion beliefs to the real evidence and not to illusions of evidence. But what's the notion of an illusion of evidence? Isn't it just the notion of an epistemic situation in which even a rational agent would mistake the illusory evidence for real evidence? So now we have the notion of a rational agent being partly explicated in terms of the notion of illusion of evidence, and then going back the other direction as well, at least as far as I can see.
So on the first part, the thing is that, as you say, on my view, the agent themselves can be perfectly rational in this case, but that also means that there's a secondary notion of rational belief in which this even counts as a rational belief, because as we started off with the idea of a rational belief as one that was supported by evidence, but then there's another way of talking about rational belief, which is the kind of belief that a rational agent would have in those circumstances, and then these are circumstances in which a rational agent would believe that there's an orange in the bowl, and so the belief itself, not just the agent, but the belief itself, comes out as rational in the second sense, but not in the first. You're as we're legitimately assuming that I will regard the belief as rational. The irrational in the first sense because it's not fully supported by the evidence. In effect, because it's not a piece of knowledge. Although it's certainly not the worst case of that, because it may. Plenty as where there's a lot of evidence on its side, but not enough by my standard. So the other one was about seeming. So illusions of evidence are just cases where you seem to have evidence that you don't have, or you seem not to have evidence that you do have. So as in some way, appearances don't match reality with respect to your evidence, appearances to you at the time, so that seeming itself is not some highly theorized notion, but just, as it were, and the fairly ordinary notion of seeming. So,
but can there be crazy, as it were, takings of things to be evidence when they aren't, as opposed to perfectly rational takings of things to be evidence.
Yes, I mean, so absolutely. I mean, and.
But then my worry was that the notion of a rational agent is now being used to define what counts as an illusion of evidence.
Well, but
at the same time, the notion of responding to real evidence as opposed to illusions of evidence is being used to define the notion of a rational agent.
So a rational agent is just an agent who's disposed to form rational beliefs and perform rational actions in the sense of ones which are supported by evidence. And so the original notion of evidence doesn't appeal to any notion of seeming or appearance. And then the characterization of a rational agent is just in terms of that original notion of rationality plus dispositions. So the notion of seeming doesn't play any role in characterizing the rationality of an agent. It's just, as it were, an observation that that someone who has, as it were, the dispositions to form rational beliefs and has a rational belief forming system will in fact be vulnerable to skeptical scenarios, both on a very small scale and on a much larger scale, because there just isn't a way of as well these. Of building an agent who will be able to tell the difference, and so the only way that you can make an agent who won't suffer from false beliefs in a skeptical scenario is by making the agent generally very skeptical and therefore not rational because they're not forming enough rational beliefs, and because they're agnostic. And so the idea was not to use the notion of seeming to characterize the rational agent, but just to do it in terms of, as I say, the original notion of rationality and plus dispositions, as were the dispositions to take you from the local level to the global level, and then simply, as it were, to use the facts about skeptical scenarios to get that a rational agent will in fact be deceived in those cases. So that, as it were, I mean, suppose, to put it a sort of brutally reductionist sort of way, I mean, suppose we were building a robot to get about in the world and manage reasonably successfully. We would be pretty much just have to accept that the robot that we built would be vulnerable to skeptical scenarios, because there just isn't a way of building a robot that isn't vulnerable to skeptical scenarios other than by building a skeptical robot who won't believe enough to be much good in the world. And so, as it were, so that one doesn't need to appeal to any notion of seeming there. This is just, as it were, a sort of brutal fact of life about building a robot, which also applies to naturally evolved creatures in the world, that as it were, in order to get enough knowledge of the world, that they have to employ cognitive strategies which will inevitably make them vulnerable to skeptical scenarios. So,
to be continued.
Yes, indeed.
Of course, we will continue in a couple of days. Thank you very much. Next question from Professor Katarzyna Jasiut.
Thank you. My question relates somewhat to the first two questions. The first question, can we do it a different way through rationality? And the second question about this clash we experience. Well, first of all, I don't like this positional account, but assuming it's correct, assuming it's fine for the purpose of this argument, I'm just wondering what you gain through going the whole hog to distinguishing kinds of beliefs, so that local and global. I mean, it seems to me it's a bit like denying Grice's modified Occam's razor when things can be done simpler. If you simply indexed, qualified the content of belief, then you would end up with a simpler concept of rationality, and you could do it, well, first of all, if you answer this question, I will tell you after what I would do later. I'm not an epistemologist, but I can tell you what I would do if I had a unified belief, but difference in content, locally justified and globally justified.
So, I mean, the local global distinction is it's not a distinction between kinds of belief. It's a distinction between the, as it were, levels of analysis of belief, and where we can either look at the status of a particular belief in particular circumstances, or we can consider, well, to use other words, the agent's cognitive policies or strategies. I mean, those make it sound a little bit more reflective than it really is, but or habits or whatever. And but both levels of analysis are needed because, on the one hand, there are particular beliefs in particular circumstances. Those are what have, what are true or false. But we also have to look at this more systematically at the behavior of the system, at a variety of times and under a variety of circumstances. And I don't see that how, as it were, any kind of systematic account can avoid making that sort of distinction. As for you were suggesting that one might achieve something by qualifying the content, but the content that I've been talking about is just something like, for example, there's an orange in that bowl. And so I don't see why a content like that needs any particular qualification. I mean, even if we were to replace that content by some other content, I think the same general distinctions would still arise.
Okay. Well, you may remember yesterday I was talking about these semi-propositional beliefs. So Dan Sperber would talk about rationality in terms of not fully understanding, but assuming everything is here fully understood, my proof is correct, but they say it's not correct, it's rational to decide. But you can have the same belief, my proof is correct, and then it's not true that my proof is correct. One is sort of indexed to yourself, one isn't. When you think of rationality, and when Grice talked about rationality of our behavior in conversation, which is sort of analogous thing in philosophy of language, he would say there are norms for rationality, and then there may be some overlying norms, which, I mean, people later suggested, like norms of, I don't know, social behavior, politeness, and so on. And now we know it didn't work, that you have this something more public on top of your private rationality. It has to be all the same. As long as your systematicity is is dynamic. Your systematicity has to be for the context. And it seems to me, as I say, I'm not an epistemologist, but when you look at logic, when you look at formal semantics, they all go in this direction of being dynamic, but not splitting the concept. So what I would do is this: I would just have belief. You would start with a sort of clash, like Gillian was talking about earlier. You start with a clash, you start with a content, it is true, it is not true, my proof is true, is not true. But then in a dynamic way, when you have belief as one operator, you can see how it merges, and your systematicity becomes a dynamic concept. I know it sounds crazy, but it's just something which would be in line with what we are seeing in other arguments of that kind. What do you think?
Well, I'm not really quite sure what you have in mind. I mean, the thing that you were talking about Sperber and full understanding, that has to do with people using scientific vocabulary with in a way which is kind of derivative from its use by experts and sort of deferential to it, and where they don't have that level of expertise.
No, it's assuming there is full understanding. So just
yes, but I mean, I actually don't think that there is a clear standard, or I mean, it's clear what full understanding is. Okay. I mean, it's, as it were, it's in the deferential cases where there are experts, of course, that people can fall short of the level of expertise of an astrophysicist or whatever it is. But but apart from those kind of deferential cases, then I mean, somebody can know more or less about oranges, for example, but I mean, that's not really what's going. I mean, that's not really going on in the case of somebody who's deceived by a wax replica, assuming it's a very good replica. I mean, even an expert on oranges could be deceived. So I don't really see that the kind of theoretical tools that you're talking about are appropriate for understanding these cases. I mean, I'm not objecting to the tools themselves, but they're tools for understanding things like the dynamics of conversation and so on. But the kind of conflicts that I've been talking about are conflicts that arise even for cats and dogs and tiny children, and other people who are not using a natural language. And so, instruments of linguistic analysis, I don't think are really going to help us. I mean, of course, these problems, the kind of conflicts between the local and the global that I've been discussing, I mean, they do also arise for sophisticated reflective language users. But those are, in a way, those are just complicated manifestations of a much more primitive kind of conflict, which can arise for even for really simple cognitive systems, because of this contrast between the local and the global, and the way that something can be defective at one level but not at another. And so I don't think that, as it were, something like Grice's apparatus or Sperber's or whatever is really designed to help with these cases.
I think, just very, very quickly, don't want to take too much time. And I think you misunderstood me completely, but perhaps it's too short time to say it. I just gave an example from another discipline where levels of rationality or distinctions between types of rationality simply proved not to work when you look at what happened after Grice. But so I simply meant take it in a dynamic way. Take animals, take cats and dogs. There is a resolution. If you then talk about systematicity where you take resolution into account, then you have a simpler story. And you can do it through a dynamic approach. But perhaps maybe we could discuss it at some later time.
I'm afraid I don't know what resolution you're talking about.
Well, the agent does one or the other, right? She either goes with her.
Sure, but that's true. That's true in
theory.
Yes, but I mean, it's true in a moral dilemma that the agent does one thing or another. But the fact that they do one thing or another, I mean, that doesn't give us any particular understanding of the normative structure of a moral dilemma.
Okay, thank you.
You're muted.
Thank you very much. Yes. I've seen it. Thank you very much. The next question is from Octavio Garcia. Octavio Garcia has a problem with his microphone. It is damaged. So he asked me to formulate his question to you.
Yeah.
If believed effectiveness depends on the possibility to act on beliefs, aren't philosophical beliefs defective, since it is hard to think about situations in which we act on those beliefs? If there are situations in which we can act on philosophical beliefs, could you provide examples? Should I act on philosophical beliefs yielded by your testimony in this talk, for example?
Well, so I don't think that, I mean, as whether the test of a particular belief is whether we act on it, because that's rather a global standard for the cognitive system, and so I think that curiosity is a cognitive virtue because it gets us a whole lot of knowledge, and some of the knowledge we can act on and some we can't. I mean, as a matter of fact, I think that in fact people do act on philosophical beliefs sometimes. I mean, for example, I think people's beliefs about truth and knowledge sometimes inspire people to act in very brave ways. I mean, they feel that those are values that they need to stand up for, so so I don't think that there's anything specifically about philosophical beliefs which make them impossible to act on. I mean, of course, for any belief, one can consider. I mean, there are ways in which you can act on it. For example, in conversation, I mean, science and indeed the humanities are full of knowledge which is mainly used in those sorts of ways, but it's also, I think, a feature of the cognitive system that it's holistic, and so there's, as it were, there's a lot of cross-checking between beliefs in one area and beliefs in another. So, just to give another sort of example, my work in epistemology has involved doing formal epistemology, where I have cooperated with an economist in writing joint papers on formal epistemology. Now, those are not ones which by themselves are going to solve the unemployment problem or anything like that, quite obviously, but they are, as it were, sufficiently significant that they are part of another intellectual discourse which certainly does have practical effects. And and if you start thinking about examples like the way in which an abstruse problem in mathematical logic, the decision problem, led to the invention of computers, and about the way in which the discourse of people like Grotius and Locke led to ideas about human rights, which have had all sorts of practical implications. I think it would be very hard to suppose that there's any area of philosophy which is in principle fenced off from practical implications, even though, of course, as with most academic subjects, as with most of what's of the propositions at issue won't have immediate effects on practice.
Thank you very much. So next one from Luis Meza Chavarria.
Thank you very much, Professor Williamson, for your excellent talk. I just wanted to ask you that, well, something that I have never fully understood about something, for example, as the total evidence view in the literature on disagreement, that I think something along these lines may be applying here, right? Because, well, we have for example, in the case of the mathematician, we have the first order evidence, that is the mathematical proof in question, and we have the second order evidence that would be the expert's testimony. Yes, so what I don't fully understand is in which cases we ought to, or how can we adequately distinguish those cases in which we really ought to attribute an evidential status to the expert's testimony for the sake of being the testimony of an expert, and those cases in which doing so would just amount to an ad verecundiam, or an appeal to authority, right? That in which just saying that because the person claiming that thesis in question is an expert would not be relevant to the resolution of the problem. Let's just think, for example, as with what happened in 2018 with Michael's Atiyah supposed proof of the Riemann hypothesis, right? He announced to the community that he supposedly had done so, but when the community analyzed the proof, it seems that it easily failed, right? So what I was thinking is that the mere fact that it was Atiyah, one of the greatest geometers of the 20th century, the one defending that it was proved, actually, I think does not pull the community, or well, does not pull in the other direction as evidence to say that the Riemann hypothesis actually has been proved. Maybe, well, that's what I was thinking, that maybe what is relevant is just analyzing what is directly on the proof, right? So, for example, in the case you proposed, maybe what would be evidence would be if these other experts can show formally that a contradiction maybe follows from the proof that the mathematician is making, or something along these lines, that they can propose something that directly evaluable upon the proof that the mathematician proposed, and not directly the fact that they are saying that the proof fails, not just that this fact is also evidence against. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So I don't think that appeals to authority are always wrong. So, for example, in the case of climate change science, most of us are completely unqualified to evaluate the details of the kind of model building and so on that has led to predictions about global warming. And often even if we went to a lecture by a leading climate scientist, I don't think we'd be in a good position to, really to evaluate how strong their arguments were. And so we do have to take a lot of things like that, at second hand, and maybe use, as it were, our sociological knowledge about the difference between a professor of climate science at Harvard and a professor of creation science at the Bob Jones University, that they to evaluate the different quality of their evidence. And of course, in the Atiyah case that you mentioned, that's simply an example of someone of immense distinction who lost it as he got very old, and I think mathematicians all knew what was going on. But just on the disagreement literature in general, I have to say that I find that literature very unsatisfying, because I think what it does is not so much the psychologization of evidence as the sociologization of evidence. So that when you look at the way that problem cases are typically set up in the disagreement literature, you're really told which people have which beliefs, or typically credences in that literature, but you're not told anything about whether those beliefs constitute knowledge, or whether they're based on correct or incorrect reasoning. But then you're expected to deliver a verdict just on the basis of this sort of sociological description. And there's a kind of, it's not sort of a sort of social version of internalism about it, because there's the implicit presupposition of setting up the problems in that way is that you have been given enough evidence to make a determination, and the problem is which determination should we make on the basis of this drastically incomplete evidence or description of the evidence. And so I think that really to approach the problems of disagreement better, what one needs a description of the situation that is not shy of saying who knows what. And I think there's a nice paper by John Hawthorne and Mia Srinivasan where they argue that sort of case, and so that of course is the trouble with these kind of examples, that it's difficult to give a description of the setup that doesn't in some way beg some crucial questions. But I was trying to do that with the mathematician case, because I was quite clear that it was in fact a valid proof and so on. But of course, to make more fine-grained judgments about such a case, we would need to know a lot more details, and would certainly be relevant whether some of these senior colleagues were suffering from Alzheimer's or whatever.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have 2 minutes more. The last question from Professor Graham Priest. Then we should begin with the next talk.
Okay, this will be brief. Hi, Tim. It may or may not surprise you that I agree with you. Okay, but when you were talking, especially in the discussion, an observation struck me, which you may or may not find useful. In the discussion, it became clear that the bottom line of the talk is that a cognitive system is going to either overgenerate or undergenerate. Okay, Now, in recursion theory, there are various arguments of a similar kind that prove that the set is not going to be recursively enumerable, because any recursive enumerable characterization is going to overgenerate or undergenerate. And the Gödel first incompleteness theorem is a paradigm example of this. Now, if you assume that our cognitive mechanism is going to have a recursive enumerable output, and I think suitably fleshed out, you can make the sort of case for that, because it's got to be rule governed in some sense, then what your argument really amounts to is that the target set in this case is not recursively enumerable, which is kind of interesting, sort of plausible. So that's just the observation. Make of it what you like.
Yeah. So thank you. Just two quick things about why I don't think one can do it as quickly as that. I mean, what one issue, of course, is that the output is, in the case of, if I'm thinking of the output as beliefs for humans, is massively dependent on the input, and perception and so on. So so it's difficult to put, as it were, structural constraints on the output if you don't have any structural constraints on the input. And the other thing is that, of course, distinctions between what's recursively enumerable and what isn't, they're really distinctions which only cut in at the level of infinite sets. I mean, those, if we're just dealing with, for example, numbers, under a million or something, then we can't, those distinctions. I mean, all the sets that we're dealing with are finite, and everything's in principle decidable, and so since human cognition as well all takes place in some maybe large finite initial segment, it seems, they might be kind of analogues in some way of those notions, but the notions we have in mathematical logic don't seem very helpful because when we're dealing with a finite tree system with some kind of in effect fixed upper bound.
Yeah, look, I agree with you. On the first point, you'd have to take it to be recursively enumerable in some oracle, okay, which is the input system.
Yes.
And so you'd have to consider the output to be similarly non-recursive enumerable in the same oracle. On the second point, I agree with you. You'd have to think of these things as, if they're actually finite, that they're at least potentially infinite in some sense, and you'd have to apply the result to that. So we're in agreement.
Yeah, okay, good. We agree about everything except the most important things of all.
So thank you very much. This was the last question. I would have more, but our time is over. So thank you very much, Professor Williamson, for your very, very interesting talk. Thank you everybody for participating. So in 1 hour questions and answers.
Well, thanks for all the discussion. It's been great for me.
That's great. Okay, so yes, it's 11:03. We should begin immediately with the next talk. With our second guest. I'll not repeat the rules because everybody's here and from the beginning. So I'll immediately pass to introduce to you our next speaker, the second speaker of the second day. Talking about Professor Manuel García Carpintero. Professor García Carpintero got his licenciatura at the University of Barcelona, where he had also his PhD. He taught at the University of Barcelona since 1984, after teaching at secondary schools. He visited CSLI, Stanford University, for 1 academic year, and for 3-month periods, the philosophy department at MIT, New York University, Oxford, and Lisbon. He was a fellow at the Center of Advanced Studies in the Humanities in Edinburgh. And he has been appointed visiting professor at the University of Lisbon, where he is a member of LANCO, CFUL. His main interests are in philosophical logic, the philosophy of language, the philosophy of mind, and related epistemological and metaphysical issues. He was awarded a Distinció de Recerca for senior researchers by the Catalan government between 2002 and 2008. Then again, in 2009, 2013, 2014, 2018, and 2019-24. That's his prize, ICREA Academia for Excellence in Research, also funded by the Generalitat de Catalunya. He's completing a book on nature of assertion, on the nature of assertion, and the contract with OUP, entitled Tell Me What You Know. His talk will be about Lewis on truth in fiction. We'll have a 1 hour exposition and talk, and then the space for question and answer. Thank you very much, Professor Garcia Carpintero. I give you the word immediately.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful that you invited me to this, and I'm very sorry that I cannot be there. I'm sorry, in fact, that given this, the differences in schedule and overlap with local holidays and other things, I'm able to attend very few of these the talks in this great conference. I suppose that you are seeing the screen that I am sharing, but now I don't see how. I wanted to share with you the handout in case you want to go back and forth, and I don't see how to do it. So I'll.
Well, you can upload it in the chat.
Yeah, this is, but I was not seeing the chat. This was the problem.
It's on the bar at the bottom. If you move the cursor down, it'll come.
Yeah, but it was with the sharing the screen. I couldn't do it anyway. I mean, I'll so I. Okay, so you have it now in the chat, and I'll go back to sharing the screen. Okay, I'll be mostly following the handout to try to stick to the time allowed. So this will be an appraisal of one of the most influential papers on current theories of fiction, David Lewis's Truth in Fiction from 1978, an appraisal from a current perspective. So I'll first find important to distinguish through different kinds of fictional discourse. This is a standard distinction that Lewis implicitly does in the paper, as do other very influential people writing in these times. Kripke, Van Inwagen. But I am using that terminology from my friend Andrea Bonomi, which I find apt. So there is first what I call textual discourse, T. This is the use. These are not kind of sentences or abstract entities, but uses of them. So this is the use by the creator of a fiction, in this case by Conan Doyle on Studying Scarlet. This is characterized because intuitively, I emphasize this is just a matter of intuitions. There are theories on which this discourse is equally truth up. But intuitively, we wouldn't fault Conan Doyle because say this is false because Holmes does not exist or anything like that. Then there is what I call paratextual discourse, P, with or without the this introductory part, this operator, and And what is characteristic of it is that it's the sort of use of language that we employ to report on what goes on in the fiction, the character of the relevant fictional world, the plot or narrative. And this is, unlike the previous one, this is intuitively truth up. We can, in this case, we would intuitively classify this as true, but if we change, we take away the negation, we will classify it as false. And then we have the metatextual, which is equally intuitively truth evaluable like P, but intuitively is not prefixable. If we put a prefix like the one I had in the paratextual case as optional, intuitively it will be false. Then the claim in that sense is not prefixable. But as I said, I mean, this is just a matter of intuitions. I mean, there are theories on which this should be also handled by assuming some kind of prefix. Now, Luis's theory is a theory of mostly of the paratextual uses, but as we will see, to develop that, and as I think anybody should, he needs to assume a theory of textual discourse, a theory of fiction. As we will see, unlike, for instance, Kripke and Van Inwagen in their works of this time, he assumes that the textual uses have a semantic proper, which I say I take to be right. We'll find further reasons later, but the idea is that proposals to imagine by fictions are uses of sentences, or at least this is what I would claim. I mean, this is one of the many controversial things I will say, and in this case is one that I will not take up here. So Stefano Predelli, for instance, in a recent book that I will be mentioning, has been developing this Kripke Van Inwagen view that textual uses they don't have a semantics proper, but well, yeah, as I say, Luis assumes the opposite, and I think he was right. He also assumes that part of their semantics is a propositional content, which is plot or narrative of fictional world that we are trying to get at in paratextual uses. And he assumes that this can be modeled as a set of possible worlds. Again, this assumption I take to be right too, although I mean, in the paper on which this is based, I point out that perhaps some more recent accounts of contents, like I mean, in fact, the small worlds accounts inspired by other papers by Kripke or situations, or even some appeal to impossible worlds for some of the objections that are famously made to Luis, and I will not consider here, would be preferable to the ones that Luis assumes. But in any case, any of these views I think are much better than others, because they make contents abstract enough so that in principle, at least, a literary work and a film adaptation may have, in principle, as I say, at least the same content. And I think that is very important and a plus for this sort of theories that Luis was assuming. Now, one of the main philosophical worries that Luis was trying to address is posed by prima facie empty names like Holmes in textual and paratextual discourse. Luis, at the beginning of the paper, offers several reasons to discard what he calls Meinongian accounts, by which he doesn't just mean, Graham Priest was just talking, he doesn't mean, strictly speaking, Meinongian views, but any view on which Holmes refers to a fictional character. which is not a real life person. Any view in which Holmes in fact refers, and it refers to some more or less exotic entity. So for instance, Meinongians on this extended sense that that Luis's uses apply also to Salmon's or Predelis or Stokes views, or Kripke's or Van Inwagen's for paratextual discourse. As I said, they think that textual discourse don't have a semantics. In this case, I don't find terribly convincing Luis's arguments. Moreover, he puts explicitly aside from his consideration metatextual uses, which are precisely the basis on which Meinongians in this extended sense build their theories. But again, this will not show up here, but I would say, so we should do a kind of global comparison between the proposal that Luis makes, explicitly on paratextual discourse, and some extensions that we can think of a similar view for metatextual discourse, and we should compare that with these Meinongian views in his sense, and so this would be part of my global appraisal. I think Luis's account, if modified along the lines that I will suggest, improves on them. But as I say, this is not, unfortunately, something that I will be able to consider here. So what he wants to do, the main goal of his paper is to provide an account of paratextual uses that is not Meinongian, that doesn't ascribe an actual referent to Holmes. So for that purpose, I have been saying that in paratextual discourse, we try to characterize the content of fictions. So why not just say, and this is the first option that he considers as our theory of truth in fiction, as our theory of fictional content, of what is the content of fictions really. Why cannot we just say that the world of a fiction like I study in Scarlet are those, as he puts it, where the plot of the fiction is enacted, where a course of events takes place that matches the story. Now, in considering this option, which seems intuitive enough, we use this apparatus of possible worlds, but we just use them to characterize this intuitive notion of the plot or the story that a fiction tells. Luis worries about circularity. I am not in general, I don't think that in general we should worry so much about circularity in philosophy. I think that we should take this kind of worries about to what extent a proposal is explanatory enough, perhaps in comparison with others. And I think that this is, in any case, this is the way I suggest we should consider the worry that Luis raises. And we can see that this intuitive theory is philosophically wanting. For instance, there is this intuitive idea, again, as almost everything, it has been challenged by some people. I cannot address their reasons, but we have the intuitive idea that fictions, the content of fictions goes beyond the explicit. Trivial ideas would be that Holmes has 2 nostrils, not 3, although this is not explicit in the fiction. So we should elaborate on this idea of the plot of a fiction so that we explain how implicit content is added to fictions. In that sense, the intuitive theory is not explanatory enough, in contrast with what Luis has to offer in terms of well-known principles that have been discussed on that we just appeal to what obtains in the actual world, to the extent that is compatible with what is explicit in the fiction, or that we appeal to what is mutually believed, what are shared beliefs at the time when the fiction was created. This is again something that I'm not going to elaborate on or discuss here, but obviously the proposals that Luis makes complete or develop in philosophically interesting ways this intuitive proposal. There is an additional issue that worries Luis and shows again that at least this almost pre-theoretical theory that what is truth in fiction is what obtains is consisting in its plot. And this comes from a worry raised by Kripke, originally against descriptive theories of names. And this is a worry that I set up here. Let's use Holmes' soup, ASIS, for the homonym of this shape, Holmes, deployed by Conan Doyle in the sentence, the utterance T at the beginning. Fictionally, in the content of this fiction, this homonym refers, because Watson uses it to refer to his friend. So it's true in the fiction that this homonym, the one that we find in the fiction, refers. However, in the intuitive sense of plot or narrative, the actual world may be one at which the plot of this story is enacted. As Luis puts it, that would be improbable, incredible, but surely possible. And nonetheless, in the actual world, this homonym, at least intuitively speaking, does not actually refer. Conan Doyle merely pretends to refer with it, but if the story is fiction, he was not referring with it. So this would be one case in which this intuitive theory could fail, or at least leaves us with no explanation, with no answer. There is something that is intuitively true in that fiction, but it's not the case at one of the worlds at which the plot of the fiction is enacted under the improbable assumption. So I was saying, Luis handles this first worry with his influential reality and mutual belief proposals for implicit content that I'm not going to go into in this presentation. What he does for the second, in the terms in which I am presenting his proposal, is expanding this intuitive sense of plot or narrative beyond merely material mode content to include also formal mode metalinguistic content. In particular, it would be in this extended sense of the intuitive notion of a plot or the content of a narrative. It would be part of the content of the fiction that we are discussing, that in fictional worlds enacting the narrative, the utterance T is actually assertorically uttered as known fact by a fictional teller, Watson in that case. And hence this homonym that we were talking about is part of the plot that this homonym is used to refer. If we extend this intuitive notion of plot beyond the material mode content to include these metalinguistic aspects, then even in the improbable and incredible but possible situation that Kripke contemplates, the actual world is not anymore one of those in which the plot, thus metalinguistically enlarged, is enacted. And then this proposal would improve on the intuitive one with which we have started. In philosophically significant ways. And this is most of what I'm going to discuss in what follows. This move by Lewis is apt for this fiction study in Scarlet, because this fiction has an explicit fictional narrator, Watson. However, it's doubtful that it works in general. And this is what I like to, as I said, this is what I will be focusing on in this presentation. What we need to properly confront these issues, I mean, so we are assuming that fictions have contents, and paratextual uses try to get at them. So to the extent that fictions have contents, to the extent that they have a semantics, as Lewis assumes, they have a metasemantics. There should be an account of how these contents are grounded, an ontology of fictions that tells us how the fictions have come to have the contents that we assume that they have. And what I'm going to try to show is that, well, Lewis, in fact, realizes this, and he provides a metasemantics that supports his metalinguistic take on this notion of plot or content of fictions. But this metasemantics that he provides in the core of the paper is misguided, or this is what I will try to show. However, he has 4 postscripts that he published when he published the paper in his philosophical papers in 1983. He has 4 postscripts, and in one of them he gestures to what I will suggest is the proper metasemantics. So this is what I will try to convince you that we would get. I mean, Hanley has a paper on these issues that is called "As Good as It Gets." He refers to Lewis's account, and what I will try to suggest, although I'm leaving aside many issues, for instance, about the generation of implicit content and other issues, but partially, at least, I will try to suggest that by moving from this metasemantics that he has in the core, in the main paper, to the one that he suggests in the postscripts, we can get his proposals on truth in fiction to be as good as it gets, as Hanley puts it. So this metasemantics that this ontology of fictions that Lewis assumes is the idea that storytelling is pretense, as he puts it. And this is, I take it, this is a version of a view that Searle presented in a paper a few years before Lewis's paper, although Lewis does not refer to Searle, but this was a view very common those days. I think that most analytic philosophers share this view, certainly Van Inwagen, Kripke, in the papers, in their works in this period, they were assuming a similar view. So this is the view that fictions are mere pretense. They are constituted by the simulation of speech acts like assertions or questions. They are pretense, but not just pretense, because as I will say, the alternative view also agrees that fictions could be constituted by pretense. The emphasis is in mere. There is nothing more to fictions than these pretenses. In particular, as Searle argues, they are not the result of sui generis dedicated to representational practices of a specific kind. I'll call it fictionalizing or fiction making. A type of speech act analogous to promises or assertions or questions should be accounted for along the same ways, of course, but with its distinctive, dedicated peculiarities. I was saying that that was, if one looks at it, that was the most extended view at the time that Lewis was writing among analytic philosophers. Nowadays, a few people endorse still variations of Searle's argument, but mostly accept Corry's and Walton's objections. In fact, in part, this paper was motivated by Stefano Predeli's trying to attempt to resurrect something like Searle's view. And in fact, he has a compelling argument, more compelling than Searle's himself, which I will discuss in a moment. So I will be calling MP to this view, that this metasemantics, this view, ontology of fiction that Lewis assumes in the paper itself. And I will be calling DR, dedicated representation view, to the alternative. So I take Walton's, in fact, to have been mostly influential for the demise for most people in current discussion of these issues of MP. On Walton's view, fictions are social artifacts that prescribe imaginings. Greg Corry offered a Gricean speech act version in the same year as Walton published his magnum opus. For Corry's non-fictionality, assertive utterances are constituted by Gricean reflexive intentions to produce belief, while fictionalizing by corresponding intentions to produce imaginings. I myself have developed a view which is a kind of rapprochement between Walton and Corry, which is a sort of Austinian constitutive rules account of fictionalizing, inspired, in fact, based to a very good extent in Tim Williamson's account of assertion. But we don't need to go into these details. We just need the contrast between the mere pretense view and the dedicated representation view for the sort of considerations that I want to make. Now, Searle, in his article, briefly considers DR and offers, as I said, he explicitly rejects this sort of view on the basis of a short argument. The premise for this argument is one that I have already granted on behalf of Lewis, but I would defend it myself. I will indicate some reasons later. The premise is that the illocutionary act of or acts performed in the utterance of a sentence is a function of the meaning of the sentence. We know, for instance, that an utterance of the sentence, "John can run a mile," is a performance of one kind of illocutionary act, and that an utterance of the sentence, "Can John run a mile," is a performance of another kind of illocutionary act, because we know that the indicative sentence form means something different from the interrogative sentence form. Some people, in fact, Corry's argument against reply to Searle rejects this premise, but I think we can grant that there should be literal, direct ways. I mean, to the extent that fictionalizing is a dedicated representational act, there should be ways of literally, directly making it, and I think there are. I will indicate them in a moment. So my problem with Searle's argument doesn't lie in the premise, but then Searle attempts what looks like a reduction ad absurdum of the dedicated representation view from this premise. He says that it follows from the premise that if fictions make representational acts other than non-fictions, we are, quote, committed to the view that words do not have their normal meanings in works of fiction, from which it would absurdly follow that, quote, to read any work of fiction, a speaker of the language would have to learn the language all over again, since every sentence in the language would have both a fictional and a non-fictional meaning. This is a bizarre argument. Granted the assumption, granted the premise, some expressions in fictions must have specific meanings, indicating that it's fiction that we are discussing. But why all? Why should we learn the whole language? In the case of the contrast between the indicative and the interrogative, it was just two expressions, the expression indicating declarative mood and the expression indicating interrogative mood. All the others may have, and in fact, have the same meaning. Well, there are other objections. I'm going to skip. Greg and Greg Curry and Walton has this other overgeneration and undergeneration objections that are also significant, but I will skip them. So I move to 13. So this was not a very convincing argument. Now Stefano Predelli, in a series of recent works, provides an alternative abductive argument and uniformity argument, as he calls it. And this is his argument. Any satisfactory theory of fiction must inevitably account for interforce relations that are parallel to the relationships between straightforward speech acts such as assertions or requests. This is the premise of or this is the main abductive premise. There are these interforce relationships in discourses that any theory should account for. And the problem, he points out, is that we find exactly the same regularities that govern actual speech acts, that govern non-fiction discourse. We find them in fiction. So because this is his reason to agree with Searle that fictionality does not bring up yet another type of force, because there is no, as it were, significant interforce relationships difference in non-fiction discourse and fiction discourse. So for illustration, consider these two sentences. I say the cat is on the mat, and then is the cat on the mat? This sounds bad or strange, jarring in a standard context. And this is because of these interforce relationships. The erotic force of the second part is in tension with the assertoric force indicated by the first part. And the idea is that if we find these two sentences in a fiction, it would sound equally jarring, equally bad. For a second example, if I say it was John who stole the camera and someone stole it, that sounds bad. And this is because the first part of the first conjunct has a presupposition, and the second asserts that presupposition. Again, these are interforce relationships, and Predelli points out that if we find this sentence in a fiction, it would sound equally jarring. Now, I don't think this argument works. I should say that there are indications of it in Searle's paper. It's not just that Predelli makes it up. He agrees that the other argument is not good, but he finds in Searle's text this other argument. It certainly improves on Searle's, but I don't think that the argument works. In the first place, the dedicated representation account can account for this, for the uniformity that we find in fiction and non-fiction. So let us say with Nichols and Stick that pretends, that let's characterize pretense as follows: to pretend that P is roughly to behave in a way that is similar to the way one would or might behave if P were the case. So a person who wants to pretend that P wants to behave more or less as he would if P were the case. Now, one of the goals for which we engage in pretense is that of conveying dedicated speech acts. So at least in some cases of irony, this is what we are doing. We pretend to be asserting that Peter is a very good friend, but we are doing that with the goal of conveying a different speech act than the one that we are pretending to make. In this case, the assertion that Peter is a very bad friend. So we can pretend to apologize with the ultimate goal of scolding somebody, doing a different dedicated speech act. Given DR, authors of literary fictions may convey their fictionalizing acts by pretending to perform the locutionary acts meant by their utterances. In fact, on Walton's account, the authors of literary fictions, with their they use the locutionary meanings of the sentences that they use as Walton puts it, as props in games of make-believe. Or the authors of drama, they just have actors pretending to perform speech acts, and this is one recourse that they use to create their stories. So this explains the uniformity that Predelli finds in fiction and non-fiction. It's explained in that it's compatible with DR that in many cases fictionalizing is done by pretending to do ordinary speech acts. I didn't present these other objections, so I will not go into that. So this shows that the argument is as an abductive argument is not good, because there is an alternative explanation compatible with the alternative theory that fictionalizing is a specific speech act. And moreover, the uniformity is limited. There is the uniformity that I have illustrated following Predelli, but later I'll mention that there are other cases that show that fictionalizing has its own specificity, and the uniformity may well break down and breaks down in many cases of fictionalizing. Okay, so far I have replied to, well, I have repeated the standard responses to Searle's original argument for the MP view of fiction, of the textual discourse. And I have also replied to Predelli's new, better argument for something like that. Now I move to the attack, as it were. I move to the main reasons why MP is not a good theory of textual discourse, of the ontology of fictions. So some fictions, like the Sherlock Holmes stories or Don Quixote or Pale Fire, Nabokov's Pale Fire, they have explicit fictional narrators. Explicit narrators, as this term is understood for my purposes, they have two features. They are fictional and they are agents, says Kania. But more specifically, we should say they are fictional tellers for fictional assertoric acts made with the declarative sentences that we find in verbal fictions. So it's not that they are just agents. What Watson or the first personal narrator of Don Quixote are doing is asserting things, fictionally, of course, but they are asserting things. This is what is distinctive of fictional narrators, as I am using the term. By the way, it's not necessary that they are fictional. So they could be, in the case of Don Quixote, there are very good reasons to think of this first personal narrator as Cervantes himself. So the important thing is not whether or not they are fictional. The important thing, so they can be fictionalized versions of real people. The important thing is that what they are doing in the fiction is telling the contents of the fictions. So here is Corey's emphasizing this aspect of fictional narrators. Now, as I said, it's compatible with the that fiction makers, fictionalizers like Doyle, tell their stories by, as it were, playing the role of fictional tellers, fictional narrators. And this is the way we can think of Doyle with Watson. Doyle is, as it were, an actor playing the role of Watson. Cervantes is playing the role of these first-personal narrators. There also allows us to assume effaced or covert narrators in fictions without explicit narrators, like the Jane Austen novels. And I agree that, and in fact, my acceptance, my partial acceptance of the uniformity argument suggests that that I'm happy to agree with Predelli, for instance, or with other people, that there are many more narrators than just explicit narrators. For instance, I think that there are very good reasons to think that in Jane Austen novels, there is also a covert effaced or implicit narrator, which in fact we have very good reasons to identify with Austen herself. However, and this is the main difference and the significant difference between MP and DR, MP requires that fictional narrators are ubiquitous. And Lewis, in fact, in the core of the paper, assumes that, because as we have seen, he assumes that the character of a fiction is conveyed by a fictional narrator making the utterances that constitute, according to him, the fiction. So he's assuming with what Derek Matravers calls the report model. In reading a novel, a reader makes believe that he's being given a report of actual events. In other words, he makes believe the content of the novel is being reported to him as known fact by a narrator. So given this MP assumption, this ontology of fictions, fictional worlds always include the reporting of their character as known fact by a teller, explicit or implicit. And this is what DR is not committed to. DR can agree, of course, agrees that some fictions are conveyed by this recourse to a fictional narrator explicit in the fiction, and can agree that sometimes fictional contents are given by this trick of assuming an implicit fictional narrator. But there is no need for this to be always the case, because according to DR, fictionalizing is a speech act of its own that can be done without being parasitic on other speech acts, in particular the tellings of a fictional narrator. So here is my reason to think that, in fact, fictionalizing can be indicated directly, literally. A declarative sentence can be literally, directly put forward for purposes other than what Tim Williamson calls flat-out assertion. I can say, yes, I suppose. I can hedge, and then I'm indicating that S is not supposed to be taken as a flat-out assertion. And I think that this is as literal as it can be. Maybe it's not a default speech acts. We need to do some kind of hedging or indicating that we are not flat-out asserting. We are supposing or guessing. But in doing that, we are using language directly and literally. And by the same token, we can say, as let's imagine, or as once upon a time. And the way I understand that, this would be textual discourses that literally convey acts of fictionalizing. As David Davis points out, it's very weird to assume that thought experiments, which are proposals to imagine are conveyed by fictional narrators. They are directly put forward by the philosopher who is presenting the thought experiment. So there could be fictions generated in this way. And so I agree with Walton and Wilson that in fact there are. Wilson provides this illustration. It's just an illustration, but is similar to the case of the thought experiment. Wilson mentions the production of certain hand shadows, a fictional story in which a certain hawk attacks and kills a hapless mole. He says there is no obvious reason to postulate that the hand shadows are themselves the fictional product of some fictional activity of showing as actual the element of the depicted tale. Of course, these are just appeal to intuitions. The intuition that in these cases the fictions are conveyed directly without this trick of assuming a fictional teller. And as I was saying, I think that even, I'm focusing on the literary case, but I'm also mentioning cases of fictions conveyed in other media. And I think it's important to keep them in mind. So one could say we can assert with pictures, for instance, documentaries are a kind of assertions. So in principle, the defender of MP could assume that a fictional film has some kind of teller who is presenting the fictional world as if it was a kind of documentary, as in an assertoric mode. So in principle, the idea is perfectly acceptable, and not only that, I think I have argued in agreement with Wilson or with Walton, Wilson in particular, that many films should be taken this way. But there is no need for that to be the case always. And so these two cases are just the case of thought experiments, and this example of the hand shadows by Wilson are just appeal to this intuition based on a philosophical theory of fictions, DR, that there could be fictions whose contents are directly given to us by the fiction maker. Now, in the next three items in the handout, I mentioned real cases, so that not to just appeal to these intuitive cases. Three cases in which fictional content is given to us in this way, directly by a fictionalizer, which in my view show that DR is a better theory of fictions and textual discourse than the mere pretense account. So one of these cases is the case of unreliable narrators. I'm not going to read these particular examples. You can do it on your own. But in the case of an unreliable narration, the unreliable narrator, some of what the unreliable narrator tells us is not true in the fiction. Maybe what is true in the fiction is just the negation of what the unreliable narrator tells us. These are contents. So the Kimbo tells us P, and if we are understanding the fiction properly, we realize that it's not P that is true in the fiction. In the fiction, it's merely true that Kimbo tells us P, but P is not true in the fiction. What is true in the fiction, in fact, is something else, perhaps not P. I'm suggesting here how we make these inferences, which again, a good way to explain how we make these inferences presupposes DR. It presupposes that, so given DR, there should be indirect ways of conveying contents based on the assumption that the agent is fictionalizing and not doing any other act. And this is the way I I'm suggesting here we understand the unreliable narration. But in any case, here we have examples, these contents that we infer, given what the unreliable narrator says, that that are not given to us as a report, because what is given to us as a report is simply not true in the fiction. We have to infer it in some other way, as I suggest here, in fact, by assuming something like DR. So this was the sort of examples that I mentioned in 22. These are not the most decisive ones, because at least in these cases, there are narrators. In the case of unreliable narrations, part of the content of these fictions are given to us by a narrator, an explicit narrator, typically. I'm just saying that other parts, sometimes crucial parts, are not given to us by the narrator, but in some other way, which I'm suggesting presupposes DR. In 23, I mentioned other cases. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of the case, the most compelling case that I use. I just ask you to think of Kafkian or surrealist stories in general. They, as many people have put it, if you think that these stories are presented to you as known fact, you would just infer that the agent is mad, and you wouldn't infer anything from that. You wouldn't get any content for them. And so these are cases similar to the previous one, in that perhaps there is some narrator, but the crucial elements of what these fictions convey to us are not inferred, are not derived by assuming that they are given to you by a teller, by a fictional narrator. In 24, I mentioned other cases that are even more interesting, in the sense that it could be that the whole thing, the whole fiction, is not given to you by any fictional narrator. There is no part of it that is given to you by a fictional narrator. The cases I mentioned can be here the problem that defenders of MP could find lies in that you may think that these are just postmodernist, strange cases, and the ones that I mentioned have this feature, but this is just because they make the case more compelling. So these would be cases in which it's clear, or it should be clear for someone properly understanding the fiction, that it is not given to you by a teller, but is given to you, is presented to you explicitly as a fiction. It's presented to you explicitly for you to realize that that it is fiction, and the fictionalizer has recourse to all kind of ways of making it clear that this is what is going on. As for instance, does Berman in persona, including a camera in the alleged fictional world. These are not, by the way, that this objection that these are postmodern cases. In fact, you can find cases like this all across the history of fiction, but again, I'll leave it the point here. So these three cases, by the way, show that this uniformity that Predeli appeals to breaks down. I mean, in these cases, what these cases show is that someone creating a fiction, someone fictionalizing, has ways specific to fiction to indicate that this is what he or she is doing, and for the audience to grasp what he is doing. And those recourses, if you found them in something that is, you are clear that is supposed not to be a fiction, if you found those recurses, these Kafkian themes or these explicit I am making this as a fiction cases, if you find them in an article in the New Yorker, in a Reporter at Large article, you could just simply not get what is going on. So it's not true that there is this wholesale uniformity that Pradelli assumes. Okay, so I think that this establishes that DR provides, I'm not going into which version of DR, but DR in general is a much better view of fiction, of the ontology of fiction and textual discourse than MP, and that it deals well with, in fact, with some of these worries that I have mentioned are considered by Lewis himself. So that a Lewisian, someone who wants to defend Lewis's account of fictional, of paratextual uses, of ascriptions of content to fictions, would be much better off and would, in fact, preserve most of the things that Lewis says by abandoning, by forgetting about this idea that fiction is pretense, in the sense that in the main body of the article, Lewis assumes that I'm moving to some version of DR, which one depends on which one offers the best account of all these cases and other issues. I conclude by, as I said, one of the main worries for Lewis was defending his anti-Mainongian view in this extended sense. This is something I haven't gone into, and I don't have the time to go into, but I just conclude by claiming that you could also avoid any form of Mainongianism. You could also avoid, for instance, the form of Mainongianism that Pradelli in earlier work, or people like those that I mentioned here, I mentioned before, following Salmon 1998, or Stoke, people who try to deal with empty names by ascribing to them a referent, even if it is some exotic entity in textual discourse. You could avoid that also by assuming DR and some adequate semantics, not very far away from what Lewis was assuming. I gave you here some references in 25. But that would be all. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Garcia Carpintero. Thank you very much for your excellent talk. Now we'll open the space for questions and answers to everybody. So please, as you already know, write me a Q or question privately to my chat, and I will pass the question, or I will give you the word to make directly the question to Professor Garcia Carpintero. At the moment, I don't see question, so I will make one. I will make one. So actually, you're applying some tools and methods of analysis typical of philosophy of language in the Anglo-Saxon tradition to talk about literary forms, because at the end it's not just what happens inside of a book relatively to a narrator, but it's about forms of literature, so historical forms of literature. This is a history inside of the literature itself. It begins a reflection on what is the literary communication, how does it function, how to fictionalize also the author, and so on, are kind of features born during the Romantic, and then there's a certain history. Is not this a way to enter some arguments, some topics were typical for another kind of philosophy, so philosophy of art and philosophy of history? So don't you go in that direction to make a kind of argument for the post-analytic tradition or scientific philosophy or logical philosophical tradition? These other areas typically elaborated, questioned by another kind of philosophy, what they call the continental tradition.
I don't know about traditions in that sense. I mean, in the continental tradition, there are works very much along the lines of this that the ones that I was discussing. For instance, in the work of Roman Ingarden, Meinong, and others. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know to what extent, and in fact, there is a lot of dialogue in recent years, to the extent that there can be people who would count themselves as continental or as analytic in that. But yeah, I mean, there are this bunch of this work in the 1970s, mostly by Luis. The people that I mentioned are the most the ones that have had strongest influence. Luis, Kripke in his talks on reference and existence, Van Inwagen, Walton's paper. He then published the book in 1990, but in the 1970s he got several highly influential papers, for instance, on this postscript in David Lewis. They may have been. I mean, they were writing in a tradition. A tradition has a history and a set of concerns, and given the way these concerns were at that time, so I think that if you look at that tradition, you can explain why most people, putting aside Walton, all the other authors, and the people, the analytic philosophers that had written on these topics before, Margaret MacDonald, for instance, in the 1950s, why all of them were assuming this view, mere pretense, the view that fiction is just parasitic on standard speech acts. You could understand that from this tradition, like maybe that would have been strange, and in fact, if you look at Meinong or Ingarden, they were not seeing things that way from the beginning. But in any case, and these people also, they were very much concerned with these issues of reference and apparent empty names, and you can explain all this in terms of this history, tradition. But the thing is that with their work, these people have Luis, Van Inwagen, Kripke, very importantly Walton, who changed the game, if I am right on this, the way I have presented things here. They have produced, I would say, an enormous understanding on these issues. The work that they have given rise to, I mean, I would just say, somebody who is interested in fiction but is pre-philosophical, hasn't has the kind of questions and worries about the distinction between fiction and non-fiction, whatever, that all of us that are interested in fictions may have. If you take them to go through a course, just the Stanford Encyclopedia articles on these topics, in very short time, they would be able to address these questions in a much more enlightened way. So whatever, I don't know. And I think that this explains why people in the other tradition, or some of them at least, are able to participate in these dialogue debates and assume Walton's or Lewis's influence. And yeah, so I don't know about traditions, but this is a tradition that has produced good illumination or philosophical understanding on these topics.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I do agree with what you said. It's also because I'm very interested in fiction. I'm very interested in the German literature and so on. And sometimes I don't know how to combine this interest with my interest in logics and epistemology and philosophy of logic. It's not so always so simple because of the historical tradition belonging to literature and self-reflection of literature and so on. Anyway, thank you very much. The next question is from Professor Graham Priest.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question, but I just want to check that I've got the view straight first, because if I haven't, then there's no question. DR, this is essentially the view that when you get someone telling a work of fiction, they're using a speech act that's sui generis, and it's not pretense, but it's a speech act like, questioning, commanding, and so on. Have I got the view right?
Yeah, this is the view, exactly.
Okay, good, good. So here's the observation. It's not objection, but it is an observation that carries some clout, I think. Look, certainly when I tell my kids a story about the Odyssey, okay, I'm a fictional narrator. As far as we know, when Homer told the story, he was telling it as truth. Okay, and that's fine. My speech act's different from Homer's because I'm a fictional narrator and he wasn't. That's okay, but the stories we tell have the same content. Okay, so the content of my story must be the same as the content of his. And since he's asserting literally, then it seems that the content of my fictional assertions, or whatever you want to call them, has got to be the same. So you're constrained, your account constrains you to a very specific kind of semantic count, namely exactly the same as you have to use for ordinary assertions. And that may well be true, but it's going to kind of limit you, and it may well force you into some kind of nonism or minonism when you spell out what the literal content of assertions are.
Thank you very much for your question. I mean, there is this standard distinction between content and force that people now question, but let's assume this. I think that you were assuming also that something like that, so that a question and so an interrogative and a declarative may have the same content, although they don't have the same meaning in general terms, because there is something else that is indicated and is part of the meaning, which is this force or whatever is. So yeah, I mean the view assumes that to the extent that in principle you can combine any content with any force. Maybe that doesn't need to be right. Maybe there are some contents that go, or at least go more naturally with some forces. And well, in fact, this is, I mean, it's very natural to think that orders or it's more natural for them to have DT content than in general for assertions. So, but
that's true. But I don't think I was assuming anything so general.
Yeah. No.
It was just that my story has the same content as Homer's.
Yeah. So, okay, yeah. So something that, in principle, it could be that something that is put forward assertorically can be, the very same content can be presented for fiction making purposes. As I was saying, in general, it's not so clear that this is that there is that much uniformity. But in any case, let's assume that that is so. Well, then, yeah, okay, that could be to the extent that we put aside qualms of this kind that I was mentioning. That yeah, we can, if we can combine any content with any force, if fictionalizing is a kind of force, then contents that can be asserted could be also put forward for fiction making or fictionalizing. To see whether this creates a problem, we need to know, or maybe, I mean, maybe it's not a problem. Maybe it follows from this that if we go straight into what these contents could be, then we should go with some Meinongian, in the strict sense, not in Lewis's extended sense, view of how referential expressions work. Maybe, I mean, this is a possible consequence to which one should be open, to the extent that the initial assumption is right. I don't think it follows myself. I think that something like what Lewis was assuming can be elaborated in a perhaps in a different semantics, which is similar to his in that it gives you abstract contents, but it doesn't need to assume the ontology of modality that he was assuming, and then it can be more flexible. But yeah, well, the general answer is, if we do assume that any content may go with any kind of dedicated force, yeah, it follows that anything that can be asserted could be put forward for fictionalizing. And then we should devise our theory of contents in such a way that is consistent with this, whatever that takes.
It doesn't force any particular semantic theory on you. I agree with that. Mm-hmm. What it does force on you is that there's no specific semantics of fiction. It must be exactly the same as the semantics of the language we use to make ordinary assertions.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that this is, I think I agree with that. I mean, as I was saying, I mean, if we move from language to representational states, so maybe we can say the same as we were saying about contents versus modes, types of mental states in general, and in principle, we can assume that whatever can be belief can be also the content of an intention, and the other way around. But then if we go into the details, that is not, as I was suggesting for the case of commands, maybe that is not totally the case, because we may find out that intentions typically have a DC, in this case, not DT, but DC content involving the one forming the intention. So there is something a little bit specific, but in general, you are right. There is no reason why the same DC content that can be the object of an intention cannot be the object of a belief. And to that extent, yeah, there shouldn't be any specific semantics for fiction. I think I agree with that. I mean, but so just one, as I have been suggesting that there are also force indicators that are that indicate meaning and convey meaning and convey literal meaning, not just, this is not purely pragmatic. Now, semanticists at most acknowledge 3 different kinds of force indicators, one for questions, one for orders or something like that, and or plans or whatever it is, and one for assertions. I have been suggesting that in fact there are much more nuanced forces that can be literally conveyed, and that we should have a place in our semantics for them. Like, for instance, you can literally indicate a conjecture or a guess, or and you can literally indicate that you are fictionalizing. So that could be specific for fiction. This fiction-making force and how that is indicated, that should be more specific to fiction. But in principle, I agree with what you are saying. We should be open to, for the content part, to have the same kind of semantic account that we have for other forces, in particular for assertions. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. I don't know, Professor Priest, are you satisfied with the answer?
I am, yes.
Wonderful. So next one is from Professor Timothy Williamson.
Yeah, actually, just a couple of little remarks prompted by your exchange with Graham about to what extent force and content are independent. I mean, one kind of case where it seems that there are contents for questions which can't be contents of assertions are with WH questions. Who killed the cat? I mean, there isn't an assertion, as it were, with the same content as who killed the cat. I mean, David Lewis had this funny view that you interpreted who killed the cat as equivalent to I ask who killed the cat, but yeah. I mean, it's very artificial. Another different sort of example that was occurring to me is a case where you actually have a bit more flexibility in fiction. I mean, particularly given the view that you were taking of it, than with assertion, is with more paradoxes. Because a more paradoxical assertion, like, it's raining and nobody will ever know that it's raining, that seems like self-defeating in some way. But it seems in principle you could have a story where something happened and nobody ever knew that it happened. So that, as it were, the constraints, at least for as far as one's supposed to be avoiding self-defeat, are in some respects a bit weaker and with fictionalizing than with asserting.
Yeah, those are very good. I mean, I should the standard. I mean, of course. I mean, Luis was just in general semantics. In a more straightforward way, I should say, than Davidson, who was suggesting the same, but with not so straightforward or forward defense, or he was just reducing all kind of sentences to declarative sentences in that way, agreeing that was a bad move, but it was perhaps utilitarianly, from a utilitarian perspective, acceptable. But of course, I mean, as I was saying, I mean, semantics these days don't go that way. And in the case of questions, they have specific contents for them, which are these classes of equivalence classes of walls. It's not. These are in fact these small walls that I was talking about are in fact that. I mean, they are just contents of questions. So it's not so clear that. I mean, there is a difference in some descriptive level. There is no doubt that the content of questions should be different from the content of declaratives, and in that way, for the reasons that you were mentioning. But perhaps for the case of fictions, we should think of them as raising questions from the beginning, and then we should think of their contents as these classes of equivalence classes of standard walls that would perhaps provide a better picture of. And the other point is, in fact, in one of these papers, I try to make this is one of the cases in which you can find, of course, I mean, if you don't do anything, more paradoxical sentence would look as jarring or bad in a fiction as in a non-fiction. But you can set up the context in such a way that it doesn't, as you were suggesting, or at least it doesn't sound as bad. So that is, I take it, one more good reason to show that there is no this uniformity that that Predelli is assuming. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and thank you very much. I think I have one last question from Luis Mesa Chavarria.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to ask Professor Garcia if he thinks that something along the lines of his proposal may be extended to a treatment, to a fictionalist treatment of mathematics, or yeah, so that would be the case.
Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, there are some connections, obvious connections between fictions and fictionalism, and so the thing is not so straightforward. So I mean, I was just speaking about the ontology of fictions themselves, and so once you have that, then you can see to what extent you can apply that to get a fictionalist treatment of some kind of discourse. But yeah, of course, I mean, there are so as I was mentioning, in the case of the paratextual discourse, we have in ordinary discourse, we have both prefix and unprefixed sentences that nonetheless are clearly used in this paratextual way. So even if I sentence 2 in my handout, even if I, in the proper context, even if I use that without the prefix, in context it could be understood as if I am just using that to report the content of a fiction. The prefix merely makes that explicit. One could think that some people interpret Luis as assuming that the prefix is somehow there in logical form, but one doesn't need to think that way. And I'm not sure whether Luis thought of this way. So it could be something merely contextual, as it were. In context makes it clear that we are not describing how the actual world is, but reporting on the content of a corpus of a fiction. Then we can say, and imagine that we can do that as Luis assumed, namely without going Meinongian in this extended sense. So without assuming that Holmes refers to anything real, anything actual, be it an abstract entity or a, strictly speaking, Meinongian, concrete, non-existent, or anything like that. Imagine that. Then we can try to think whether we can apply the same trick to any discourse to which, for some philosophical reason, we find motivating to find a fictionalist discourse. So we can say, if it is mathematics, as you were saying, you can say, well, these sentences are not asserted, are not being proposed to be asserted literally, or the way we should think that they have some kind of prefix like that. They just report what goes on in some corpus or some fiction that mathematicians concoct, something like that. Yeah, this has been this is the way Van Frasen also suggests to think of discourse about theoretical entities, or yeah, I mean, of course, so this should be the inspiration, a good account of how, strictly speaking, discourse about fiction works should be the basis for fictionalist treatments of other discourse. Then it's a question to see whether they work or they don't, or maybe this is a good way of seeing that they don't work. I think in some cases they do. So for metatextual discourse, for explicit discourse about fictional entities, I think that a sort of fictional treatment like the one that you are suggesting does a pretty good job. You don't need to, so we don't need to assume that we refer ever to exotic entities with Holmes, not even in metatextual discourse. But I'm very skeptical about other cases like mathematics or science or. But yeah, the short answer is yes. I mean, get a good semantics for paratextual discourse and a good basis, a good metasemantic basis for that in a good semantics for fictional discourse, and then see to what extent you can devise fictionalist treatment of this or that or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Garcia Carpintero. Actually, I have two questions more. One second question from Professor Graham Priest.
Okay, thank you. So this is a thought, and it's about the speech act that's involved when you tell a fiction. Does it have a standard name, by the way? What am I going to call it?
Mm-hmm. This is one of the, I mean, I have been putting in this camp DR. I have been placing Walton.
No, but I want the name for the speech act.
Okay.
I asked a question about it. What is it?
So in any case, this is one of the good reasons. I mean, in this DR camp, there are people who would be very unhappy with speaking of speech acts. And one of the reasons is precisely this, that the one that you are, I mean,
this is not an objection. I just want a name so I can ask.
Yeah. Well, but in any case, it has been proposed as an objection. That is curious that we don't have a name for that. But anyway, I was using. Corey uses fiction making. I have been using fictionalizing. Other people
let's call
say storyfying, something like that. Yeah.
Okay. So when you got the speech act, fictional making, there's a question of whether it's sui generis or it can be reduced to something else. Mm-hmm. So, for example, Frege held that there's no sui generis speech act of denial. Mm-hmm. It's the same as asserting a negation. I mean, I think that's wrong, but never mind. It indicates the kind of move that mm-hmm. someone might make. Now, question is, could you do the same for fictionalizing? Well, look, here's a thought that might be worth thinking about. Sherlock Holmes lived in Baker Street. That's not literally true. What is literally true is in the fiction by Conan Doyle, Holmes lived in Baker Street. So we stick in this prefix, and mostly it's left tacit. Okay. Now, suppose that sort of a fictional speech act of P is really an assertion of in the fiction being told P. Mm-hmm. Okay. You might think that reduces the fictionalizing speech act to the speech act of assertion. So I'm not saying this is right, but I think it's worth thinking about. I mean, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. So this is the same strategy. I call that the flattening strategy that Tim was mentioning before, that David Lewis in General Semantics and Davidson in his papers on mood, suggesting for all speech acts except for assertion. So that they all had this prefix. You put this prefix. I am hereby commanding you that. I'm hereby. So this would be the strategy. And in fact, Michael David defended this for the case of fiction making. put a kind, in the same sense that for the paratextual, we assume some prefix, implicit or explicit, according to the fiction, blah, blah. In the case of the textual discourse, the prefix could be something like, it is to be imagined that, or something of the sort. And then then people may have worries about whether these prefixes are there in logical form or not, but then you can devise contextualist versions of this strategy, in which is the context that indicates that you are not speaking about the actual world, but you are describing, you are operating under this tacit prefix or operator. And in fact, Predeli in earlier times has the best, in my view, the best version of this view in a paper in 1997. So in the same sense that I can, if I use here, typically I refer to the place in which I am speaking, but in some contexts I can change. I can use here to refer to some other place, the same with now. So the same applies to the modality, as it were. If I speak in ordinary context, I'm describing the actual world, or I'm representing myself as describing the actual world. But in some cases, I indicate clearly, contextually, that I'm just describing a fictional world, the fictional world as it is going to be for the fiction that I am creating, something like that. And this can be done without a prefix in logical form or anything like that. And Marga Reimer, François Recanati, they have versions of this sort of view. I think it puts the curve, it's the same thing as with the flattening strategy. I don't think, in general, I don't think that you really get rid of anything and you get any illumination from these things. You need to know what, so there is something like commanding, which is fundamental and more basic. It's a kind of activity that is to be specified in some other way, in some way or other. And once you understand that, then you can explicate how we can concoct an expression that indicates that. But you need to know that before. And it's, let me put it this way. It's not illuminating to just say, to turn everything into a description, and it's not going to, I don't think it helps you to get rid of or to properly illuminate what is going on. So this is my take on that. I mean, you need to understand what commanding is, what questioning is, what asserting is, and this, or promising, and these are things that are on the same plane. You would need to the same sort of general theory to explain these things, and then you can understand what is the meaning of prefixes that we can use to indicate these things. But first, you need the other. And whatever you say for promising or asserting, something like that, but with its own specificity, is going to apply to fictionalizing.
Thank you.
No, thank you for the question.
So, thank you very much. I have one question more from Professor Sanford Goldberg.
Manolo, it's great to see you.
Great to see you, Sandy.
Thanks so much for a nice talk. I want to ask a question about the Speech Act as well, and in particular about your, if you like, your norm in note 9, when you say one ought fictionalize P only if one provides thereby one's audience with a reason to imagine P. And what I want to do is I want to query why you appeal to reason to imagine. I think I can see why you do. My guess is that it has to do with the epistemology or the justification of claims regarding fictions. But my question to you is whether you need to appeal to creating or providing a reason in order to capture that. And here's one reason why I think it would be better not to appeal to reasons. Whatever we're doing when we're fictionalizing, to use your term for the Speech Act, it strikes me that it shares a lot of features with assertion. I think Graham was picking up on that, and everybody recognizes this. But notice what the corresponding norm for assertion would be if you used reason. It would be one ought assert P only if one thereby either provides or purports to provide one's audience with a reason to believe P. You and I both, and many others in this Zoom room, reject that analysis of assertion. The appeal to reasons there, I think, is unnecessary. And I'm wondering if you've considered other ways of trying to get at whatever it is that you're trying to get at by appeal to reasons in your norm for fictionalizing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for asking me about this, which is, of course, I mean, what what most interests me is the development of my own personal. So I got at this. Catherine Abel, who has a similar view to mine, I think is the closest in the literature. She thinks that the speech act of fictionalizing is a kind of declaration so it's like baptizing or I don't like this because this is not specific enough. I mean, in fact, all speech acts are declarations. It's just that what Searle and Austin put in the declaration category are those that are not very interesting, linguistically speaking, or they are very specific to certain practices. I think it's closer to the truth to put fictionalizing in the vicinity of, I mean, Walton and Corey, and they speak of prescriptions. So it's a kind of directive speech act. It should be classified under. And then this is the way I got to this. And then it's curious that since I mean, Tim wrote that paper on assertion that has been very illuminating for many of us because we never understood what Searle was up to with all these norms, and then we constitutive rules, and then we understood a way of thinking of norms, constitutive rules that was clear enough and didn't have extravagant consequences. But then most people have dedicated their lives to tinker with whether the norm is this or that, and they haven't. As far as I know, there is very little work in this tradition. For instance, on articulating. So if assertion is defined by a norm, questioning or I mean directives in general, I take it that questions are just a linguistically interesting but kind of directive. Directives in general should have a norm, and then very few people have thought about. And this is the way I went to that, and then there are. I mean, I say very few people, but there is a tradition of thinking about norms for commands or requests or proposals, and it works along these lines. So the norm is that for them is that in general they should. So a proposal or a command is good if the proposal itself constitutes a reason for the becoming the case of the content. So something like, I mean, a desire is good if it is a reason for it to be satisfied, something like that. Of course, there are bad desires and there are bad commands that are not good. That is the way I went to that. But there are many more things. So there is something that is, I mean, Tim speaks very wisely about flat-out assertion, which is a very specific sort of a speech act. If you wanted to characterize assertion in general as a more generic thing, then you should concoct a norm that is common to conjectures and guesses and presuppositions and many others. And then, I mean, maybe there is nothing like that, but if it's something, it should be much less specific than knowledge or anything like that. It should be something like putting people in a good epistemic position or in a better, so if we can have a kind of measure of good epistemic positions, a general norm for assertion should be something like putting people in an epistemic position above a given threshold given by. So my problem with fiction is similar because it's not flat out fictionalizing, as it were, but it's something very general that applies to is intended to apply to many different ways of fictionalizing. And then the idea is to combine these two, the giving a reason for proposals with this very generic form of giving a reason for engaging in an imaginative project which is interesting enough, as it were, which is above a certain threshold in context for people like you, your age. I don't know. That is the idea that I have tried to elaborate much better than, I mean, of course, I mean, just being a reason. There are many sorts of reasons. So there are many more details missing, which I hope I could provide.
So just a quick follow-up. I think I'm here doing a little self-diagnosis. I had always, I guess, with Graham, or what I think Graham was assuming, I had always thought that fictionalizing is a lot like assertion. What you're suggesting is it may be less like assertion than I had assumed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's much more like directives. Mm-hmm. I mean, in these views that I was mentioning, the Predeli's earlier view, Reimer, Recanati, they are just like assertions. It's just that instead of being assertions about the actual world, they are assertions about a fictional world. But in my view, this is not an illuminating way of going. Mm-hmm.
One last thought, and I'm sorry for following this up. I'm trying now to articulate my reason for assuming they had been more like assertions. One thing that comes to mind, I wonder what you think of this. When you think of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and what he's doing, we can aptly describe what he's doing in the book as describing the world of Sherlock Holmes. Describing seems to be the kind of thing that goes with asserting. It might be that it can go also with the kind of speech acts that are similar to fictionalizing on your view, but that's just a thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's just the problem is with the fictional world. What is this fictional world, and what is describing a fictional world? And then, in my view, you have to. The best way to elaborate that is to say something like giving reasons to engage in an imaginative project, and if you are giving reasons, it's because the imaginative project that you are suggesting is interesting enough for you to spend time exploring that. And that is much more explanatory than just this talk of description of the fictional world. That's the way I see it. But thank you again for your questions. Good.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for taking part in the discussion. I don't see at the moment any further question. Anyway, it's right now 13 to 1 o'clock, so 13 to 1. And I think we can close the session.
It's good for me because here they are closing the building in 10 minutes. So.
Yeah, you said me before also because this is quite a good idea right now. Let me just remind you a couple of things because we will have our second block of today in 1 hour and 13 minutes. It would be 2 o'clock in Costa Rica, and yeah, in Spain it would be 10 o'clock. 9 o'clock in England, I think. Yeah, if I'm right. Okay. So let me remind you our titles and our themes of today, the topics. I think you see my page. We have a 2 o'clock till 20 to 4, Professor Paul Boghossian, Kripke, Quine, the adoption problem, and the empirical conception of logic. Following, from 20 to 4, at 20 past 5 in Costa Rica, Professor Sanfo Goldberg on speaker expectation of her audience, the case of telling. So, I hope I will see you all at 2 o'clock in Costa Rica. And thank you very much for taking part in our event. And if I don't see you today, see you in the next days.
Thank you for your questions. Thank you very much for the session.